do we continue feeding the world without consuming the planet? In every part of the world, we're facing growing crises that are devastating food security and pushing nature to the point of no return. We still have the chance to make better choices. Alongside farmers, businesses, governments, and everyone across the food chain, Yara is committed to growing nature-positive solutions that can lead to real change and a food future for all. From deepening climate crisis to growing clean carbon resources, from declining farmer livelihoods to growing paths to prosperity, from depleted lands and soils to growing regenerative, healthy farms, from decreasing food security to growing access to abundant, nutritious food, from despairing for our food future to growing the courage to transform. In every part of the world, it's time to grow a nature-positive food future for all. No one can do this alone, and there is no time to wait. Let's commit to real change.
Velkommen alle sammen til et høstseminar arrangert av Agri-analyse og Yara. Vi forsøker å plukke opp tråden fra i fjor. Vi er i en verden med store endringer, og vi forsøker å trekke deler av det som skjer rundt oss inn i Norge. Temaet i år, titel på årets seminar, er sikker mat i en usikker verden, og vi håper at dere i hvert fall får et relativt godt inntrykk av en del av de store kreftene som er rundt oss i dag. I will switch to English on behalf of our English-speaking guests. And by doing that, I will also introduce the moderator of today, Laila Bukhari, working in Yara. And welcome, Laila, and take us through the day.
Thank you, Anders. A very good afternoon to everyone. Minister, colleagues, friends, welcome also from my side to Yara. My name is Laila Bukhari, as was said, and I have the pleasure of guiding you through today's event. We have an incredible lineup, and I mean incredible lineup of speakers who've joined us here today. From Brussels, from Brazil, from Rome, from Oslo, from around the world. All will be speaking on topics that I know will engage you or should engage you. And we will be diving right into the issues shortly. But first, a few practical things. Security first. Security always first. In case of emergency evacuation, meeting point is outside behind the building, and just follow the Yara crowd and you'll find it. Easiest way out. Secondly, restrooms, bathrooms, toilets are out in the hallway to the right or across from the reception and around. There will be 2 breaks during today's events, some coffee, tea, refreshments, a snack, ample time for networking and discussions. The whole session will be streamed and recorded. Welcome also to those of you who have joined us online. Now, for those of you who are watching us online and here in Yara HQ, but not in the auditorium, there is a possibility of watching the whole event with your colleagues in a couple of hubs on the 2nd and the 3rd floor. There will also be possibilities of asking questions in a couple of Q&A sessions later this afternoon. In the email that you should have received on Friday, there's a link that you can click on and ask your question. Very simple. Please go in and post your questions, join the discussion, and we'll do our best at including all questions, time allowing. Now to the real stuff. Please join me in welcoming Lars Røsegg, the EVP Corporate Development and Deputy CEO of Yara. Please.
Thank you so much, Laila, Minister, Director General, guests, speakers, colleagues, both here and online. Welcome. We are delighted to have the opportunity to host you all here today. On February 24th, the bombs started falling over Ukraine. 2 days later, on February 26th, our office in Kiev was hit by a missile. Luckily, without any employees being harmed. Step by step, we see the war in Ukraine moving closer to Norway as it has spread. From day one, we in Yara have felt strongly that we are part of this war, and there are two reasons for this. We have both Ukrainian and Russian employees, and we saw early on that food can be used as a weapon, and we raised our voices already in March. Because we believe that never before has food and energy been used more strategically and calculated as weapons in a war as what we see now. And it comes at a time when we know that every fourth second a person in this world dies from hunger. And if Europe does not pay attention and secure continued food and fertilizer production in our region, our dependency on Russia may very quickly shift from energy dependency to food dependency. But the invasion of Ukraine did not break the food system. It came on top of an already broken system needing to be repaired. The effects of climate change, cost increases, and COVID were already apparent. The food system accounts for approximately 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. It accounts for 70% of all freshwater use. We are experiencing massive biodiversity loss. 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. We see more and more extreme weather, such as floods and droughts, directly ruining harvests. The number of people going hungry to bed is surpassing 800 million, and the number of people facing acute hunger has doubled. So what have we in Yara done in this situation? We are a global leader in fertilizer production. And why is fertilizer important? Well, it's because we know that 50% of global food production depends on the use of fertilizer. And we know that the yield loss not using fertilizer can be as high as 50%. We also know that the European production of fertilizer has half the carbon footprint of Russian, with Chinese fertilizer having an even higher carbon footprint than the Russian. That's why it's been a key target for us to keep production running, because it's in our mission to responsibly feed the world and protect the planet. However, let's right now address the elephant in the room, namely profits. Because Yara, just like Norway as a nation, has been highly profitable throughout this crisis. We raised this dilemma already in March in an op-ed and in several interviews. We raised the dilemma that while food and fertilizer price increases may short-term lift Yara's profits, it's not the situation we want, and not the situation we believe benefits neither Yara nor Norway as a large energy supplier long-term. We raised the point that a world with surging food prices and limited supply is a world with more starvation, with more conflict, with migration, human tragedies, and lower global economic growth. That's why we must make sure we jointly, amongst private companies and public authorities, take the right steps to manage the crisis at the same time as we act responsibly with the profits we generate short-term. So let me start with the latter point. In Yara, we are investing heavily in our own production facilities to ensure they keep running, getting fertilizer out in a supply-restricted market. We have delivered more than 1,200 truck and train loads of fertilizers to Ukraine to support their harvest. We established Action Africa during COVID with a donation of 250 million Norwegian kroners in premium fertilizers, reaching 250,000 smallholder farmers with product and advice. We launched Grow Ghana during the war with approximately 250 million kroner again to give 1 bag of fertilizer for free to food-producing farmers in order to bring the price down, and so far we've donated approximately 100,000 bags of fertilizer, reaching 35,000 farmers. And we support Sustain Africa, putting together a consortium to support smallholders with USAID, Rabobank, and the Gates Foundation. And we continue to be vocal in the need for Norway as a nation to step up our international humanitarian and financial efforts in times which call for solidarity and sharing. A mission of solidarity and sharing I know the Minister strongly supports. In Yara's opinion, Norway can and should do even more. The world desperately needs to manage two incredibly intertwined and complex challenges: the short-term tackling of a food catastrophe and the long-term transformation for a zero-net future. And it is essential that we manage both, that the war in Ukraine doesn't destroy the efforts to decarbonize. We've therefore been quite vocal in our dialogue with governments, both here in Norway and EU, plus on global arenas such as the UN, on what's needed. Keep food and fertilizer trade flows going to secure supply and reduce hunger. Massive investments in renewable energy to accelerate the shift to green fertilizers, thereby also reducing the energy dependency on Russia. Avoid a situation where Europe's reduction of gas imports is coupled with an increasing acceptance of implicit gas imports through fertilizers, where gas is the main input factor in the production of fertilizer today. Instead, we must build regional and local resilience, supporting European industry. The opposite would simply mean closing European fertilizer industry, and by that accepting a future with Europe being largely food dependent on others, here under Russia. Never has food and fertilizer been higher on the world agenda, and never has the need to come together and find common ground and common solutions been stronger. We have a dream team of speakers and panelists here today. Over the past months, we've had the privilege of engaging in open discussions across, as example, both the UN General Assembly and our own leadership summit with the Minister of International Development. And it is with great pleasure I hereby yield the floor.
Thank you so much. Is the mic on? Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction, and first of all, thank you for inviting me to this event. I am absolutely thrilled that we are able to put this at the core of our political discussions and at the discussions between politics and business, not only in Oslo, but around the world, basically on any multilateral arena that I have where I have been lately. This is on top of the agenda, and as it should be. So let me start by thanking you for being partners in food security. This room does not need that reminding, but we need all hands on deck. 1 in 10 of the global population faces hunger. Estimates from FAO. 1 in 10. And the number is rising. At the same time, we also know that reaching the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's further away than it has ever been before. I just came from an event at the University of Oslo discussing, the quite gloomy picture for reaching the SDGs by the year 2030. Now, I am convinced that investing in the primary sector, in food production, in the long value chain from the local producers to the regional and local markets, that can create some amazing ripple effects in terms of global development. But we know that the regional disparities are very large. Africa bears the heaviest burden. 1 in 5 people in Africa were facing hunger last year. But as I said, in many meetings I have attended lately, the voices have been very strong and clear, and especially the African voices. Africa needs to produce its own food. Senegal's president, Macky Sall, and he is also currently the president of the African Union, he said that Africa must take the lead in the efforts to increase the continent's local and national food production. I could not agree more. President Sall also called, as he spoke at the General Assembly in the UN a couple of months ago, he said that this is a paradigm shift. We are standing in front of a paradigm shift. I hope he is right. And I truly believe there is a momentum. As we spoke before I entered the stage, we were just saying that, you know, it's quite amazing that when Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, opens his speech, you know, maybe the world's most important speech in a year, the speech to open the General Assembly at the UN, and he opens it by by rallying for fertilizers with a big photo of the ships going out from Odessa. But you know, when Antonio Guterres starts his speech at the General Assembly on fertilizers, I believe that is a game changer. But why is Macky Sall and basically all African politicians I meet these days so engaged in increasing the national food production? Well, for obvious reasons. Sub-Sahara Africa imports food for more than $56 billion annually. And the World Bank estimates that this figure will grow to 110 billion by 2025. That is absurd, it's unacceptable, and it is the totally opposite track of where we should be heading in order to ensure development in Africa, because Africa has the potential to feed itself and become a net exporter, and the continent can and should provide much needed food for its own continent. But the drive and the commitment to achieve that obviously has to lie to be nationally instigated. Only then will the solutions be durable, but global business and development partners such as Norway can play a part. And I see that many partners are eager to support the national efforts. Yara is obviously one of those important partners. You have a strong vision for food security. You demonstrate determination to provide solutions, and I truly appreciate the close dialogue that we have on food security. And I also hear from our partners in the Global South that they value their partnership with Yara very much. What we need is innovation, finance, and political will, because this is a solvable problem. We have different roles, we have different priorities, different means, but we do share the same goals. As Minister of International Development, I have put food security as a top priority. That is because I truly believe that SDG 2, or hunger in the world, is a solvable problem. And I also believe that the agricultural sector is a key sector for national development. However, it has been neglected for many years. So for our part, for Norway's part, food security is at the top of our agenda in our development policies. In a few weeks, we will launch our new strategy on food security in our development policy. And it will be a sharpened policy which consolidates our involvement in this field. Our focus will be on small-scale food producers, most of whom are women. And it's quite absurd because, as many of you know, while in Africa south of Sahara, 70 to 80% of the population is engaged in agriculture or fisheries. At the same time, these families are the most prone to hunger. The food producers in Africa are the most likely to suffer from hunger. So we need to strengthen their productivity, But we need to do that while we build local value chains and local markets. So our aim is to increase local and national food security while at the same time creating those ripple effects with job creation and value creation along the whole value chain. And obviously private sector such as Yara is essential to connect the dots. Turning now briefly to the connection or the interlinkages between food security and climate change. One of the main objectives of the Paris Agreement is to fight climate change in a manner, and I'm quoting, in a manner that does not threaten food production. Climate change and development policy cannot be separated. It's essential that we connect our efforts on food security with other priority arenas or areas such as climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as renewable energy. And we need tailor-made solutions. And Yara knows everything about this. Fertilizer companies know how the solutions can be created, tailor-made for local context, local resources. Fertilizer production is essential in that context. And the challenges of food production and climate change must be addressed in the UN climate negotiations. And I am truly thrilled that this has been put so high on the agenda of the COP27 starting up in Egypt next week. Unfortunately, I must say that there are many colleagues from African countries who are quite well, to put it mildly, realistic or not necessarily optimistic in terms of outcome. I see it as Norway's role to underpin, to listen to the clear demands from African countries at the COP, and basically that evolves around two priorities: food production, the role of food production in climate, and financing adaptation. We have come further on climate financing for mitigation. We still have to step up on adaptation, and that is something we try to deliver from the Norwegian side. We have a food price crisis today. Until now, the world has produced enough food to feed everyone. The distribution has been wrong, the price has been too high, but the food has been out there. One harvest from now, the UN says that we face a global food shortage. We have never seen it before in history. And availability of fertilizers, especially for small-scale producers, are at the core of that problem. Norway is engaged on several fronts to address that situation. We are collaborating with the US on the Global Fertilizer Challenge Initiative, which intends to optimize the use of fertilizers and reduce fertilizer loss. And as I said, our emphasis will particularly be on smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and stimulate increased public-private partnerships and supporting initiatives like the one on soil health and data use, which Yara is involved in. As you can see, this is a topic close to my heart, and I believe that I have overstepped my minutes, so I will skip some of the pages. And simply sum up. I mentioned our new strategy for food security and development policy. To implement that strategy, we aim to support multilateral development and development banks and other international financing institutions in developing guarantee loans and first loss mechanisms to provide support to the agricultural industry, working with farmers, working with SMEs. That should provide better access for farmers to source key inputs such as fertilizers. And I believe that collectively, in collaboration with all good forces, we can ensure larger harvests, focusing on the whole fertilizer value chain, provide nutritious food, to more people and actually advance on the SDG too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Tvinnereim and Lars Østert, for those introductory remarks. There's a lot to delve into here. And we have about 15-20 minutes to get into the Q&A. There are already people who are sending in questions, which is great. So please do that, keep doing that. You can also enter the link by going into yara.no. I'm doing my job, you see. You've touched on a number of different issues here, and I'm going to repeat some of them to see if we can go deeper into some of it as we go along. So excuse me if we are repeating some of the issues. Firstly, let me start off with asking you, how does the current world situation complicate our objectives of securing enough nutritious food to more people, taking into account that, among other things, we now have fertilizer prices that have increased, etc. How does it complicate our jobs? Let me start with the minister.
Where to start? Mm-hmm. You know, when I took this job almost exactly a year ago, and I put food security on top of the agenda, all the indicators were heading in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. Hunger was on the increase. I remember David Beasley, who received the Nobel Peace Prize, he had his speech last year, and he said, 2022 is going to be a horrible year for food security. And then after 2 months came the war in Ukraine, which is simply so challenging. So obviously the war, as you know, the war itself is a huge challenge for getting food and fertilizer or input to fertilizers out there. That is one thing. The inflation that it has created is throwing tens and tens of millions of people into extreme poverty because the food prices and energy prices are so high. But, you know, in addition to that, speaking from the point of view of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I also see how the war is making it so much more challenging to work multilaterally. We come from a place where there was optimism, and, you know, the multilateral arenas worked. We all knew we had the roadmap, we have the SDGs. We just had to, you know, put our act together. And now we see that there is a geopolitical element in this that is truly complicating it. And we see that there is a rally for the narrative where Russia is, pardon me for saying it, but sometimes I think that they are leading that rally because they are really working hard to get their story through to our partners in the South, and that is making it a whole lot more difficult.
Lars, and in your job and for Yara, how does the world situation complicate our mission?
Well, it complicates it greatly. I mean, the global food system over decades, and we've been part of that, right, has been built on global value chains working. It has been built on global interdependencies. What we see now is that does not work anymore. And we sadly also see an increased tendency, as I touched on, for regionalization. What that does is that the sources and the uses of fertilizer and food are not in the same places. And in addition to that, as part of this conflict, as part of the war, it's being used as a weapon. We saw as late as Friday that the grain export was again stopped, and we saw on Saturday that the EU was calling on that to resume. And it is a reality that huge sources of raw materials for food production come from sources in Russia and in Ukraine. So that makes it incredibly difficult. What I believe is imperative now is that we make sure, like the EU has shown so forcefully over the past months, that we come together and that we stand together and unite in addressing the situation and reducing dependency on Russia in this situation in the global food system. Now, we talk a lot about the challenges, but it's possible to solve. But it will require the best of us. It will require that we stand together, and it will require that we run faster than we've done in the past.
that is the big scale, the global politics, etc. Let's move to the ground, if you like. And there's a question here, an interesting question from the audience or somewhere in the world. In 2011, we saw a farmer uprising starting in Tunisia. In many ways, led to what later has been called the Arab Spring. What do you think we can expect this winter, or can we expect something similar this winter? Who would like to take that?
I can start. It's an extremely good question and relevant observation. I came from Addis Ababa just 2 weeks ago, and I took part in a high-level meeting on food security with ministers of agriculture from many African countries present. And it was, and it's fascinating to sit there as European minister and just listen, because you get the messages so unfiltered. And one thing that came from many countries was, you need to understand that food security is part of our national security agenda. And they were all concerned about the effects on, for example, social uprising in their countries, and they've started to see it. It's going to get worse, and we are in this together, and we need to get that message passed through to European politicians as well, because this will be a really tough winter.
Anything, Lars, on this?
Yeah, no, of course, covered very well. I think the visibility, needless to say, is extremely low, and then I tend to think that let's focus on what we can control. And from us as a fertilizer company, one of the most important things I believe we can do is to make sure that our production is running. And I've been amazed by the organization and the capabilities to keep our production running over the past 2-3 years, with COVID, with conflict, with soaring energy costs, etc. So I think that is a key focus area for us. And then having the debate, having arenas like this one, where we actually come together and discuss this, and out of that derive concrete actions, I think is absolutely key.
Concrete actions.
I wanted to make add an extra point, which is very interesting, an analysis of what's happening in these countries where we work. Because in the past, when we have seen spiking food prices, that has normally, the other side of that coin is that that also provides income for the farmer. What is so different in this situation is that the food and energy prices are spiking, but so does the fertilizers. So we will see social disturbances and uprisings in the cities, but we will also see great frustration among the rural population, and that is a totally new situation. So it's and many countries are concerned about exactly that.
And that's a perfect segue into another question from the audience. How shall we help poor countries afford to buy food in a situation with very high prices on commodities? What are the practical steps to go further on into this?
Well, I think one of the key items here is productivity. And if you look over the past decades and over the past 100 years, you see that the improvements in productivity has been dramatically lagging in several parts of the world compared to, for example, Europe. So to be able to go and provide the right inputs, but also the right advice and digital tools in how to increase your yields is an essential component in that, because it's absolutely crucial that we need to support farmer profitability. It's extremely demanding to be a farmer, and the farm profitability is under pressure, and we need to alleviate that. And that goes for the whole value chain, of course, to secure that there is sufficient supply to take pressure out of the market. But I was traveling in Asia a few weeks ago, and I met one farmer, and he said, I know exactly what to do to have a more carbon positive or to reduce the carbon emissions in my farming. But at the end of the day, when I come with my crop, my customer will not pay me 1 single cent extra for the efforts and the costs I've had into making that happen. That's not sustainable.
I'd like us to transition to green transition towards 2050. what do we see, or what do you see as the greatest challenges in the transitioning to green? It's a big question, I know, but to take out some points on this, what are some of the challenges in the green transition? You mentioned one, Lars.
Yeah, this could be a really long answer. I'll try
Make it
to make
short.
it short.
Try to make it short.
Well, the challenge is that there are more and more people in the world, less resources, and we have to create a totally new food system. Okay, it's a huge
soundbite.
It's a huge task because we cannot continue to produce food the same way that we have done, and we will have to produce for more people in a more challenging climate, and that's why you, as fertilizer producers, must be really smart. And we have to get the solutions out there very quickly, and we cannot continue with business as usual, and we have to create. But that's also the opportunity, because we have to, like you said, the global value chains have proved their insufficiency. So we have to localize production of both food, fertilizer, all inputs. But that's also an opportunity for job creation and development.
So the opportunities, can you share some examples of what Yara is doing in this when it comes to green transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fundamental thing for Europe and for Norway, for that sake, the green transition is a fantastic opportunity if we seize it. And the European authorities have been leading the way in many ways when it comes to setting expectations. But what that needs to be accompanied by is the prerequisites to make that an opportunity, to create new industry and to create new jobs. For example, we are here in Norway. We have plans to decarbonize our ammonia facility in Porsgrunn, which would take away 800,000 tons of CO2 every year from the Norwegian balance. And in Sluiskil in the Netherlands, we have initiated a carbon capture and storage project with the same potential to reduce 800,000 tons a year. Now, what are common denominators for the green transition is that we need a dramatic acceleration of the build of renewable energy. Because what it will expect from us, our descendants, is that we do this in a green way, and that we don't source, for example, food production from natural gas, but from electrolysis and from clean hydrogen, from clean ammonia. Then we need to see a speed which is very different from what we've seen in the past. That will put expectations on us as a company to invest and be ready, but also on the regulatory side, for the regulatory processes to actually go much faster than what they do today.
Minister Tvinnereim, we've heard in a number of your talks, among others at the Security Council, where there was an open debate on conflict and food security. You stressed the importance of, and you did it here again today, the importance of private-public partnerships, how important it is for your agenda, on top of your list, food security, but you cannot achieve the goals that you have without partnering with the private sector. How can Yara help you achieve your government goals?
Well, Yara is already, I mean, we work together on a number of topics and projects and programs, and Yara is an extremely important actor in, some of, like in Kenya, for example, with the Farm to Market Alliance. What we need to do together is scale it up, because we know what can be done, but it needs to be scaled up. And I mean, aid is not going to save the world. So I need to use those, after all, scarce ODA resources to leverage other money and get other money on board. What we are trying to, research is to find guarantee schemes, mechanisms where we can provide some kind of guarantee to get the private money on board, and reducing the risk for the big companies, but also the small-scale, smallholder farmer, who is also a businessman, facing enormous risk every day. So if we can use ODA to limit the risk, that will take us a long way.
Yeah, I mean, just a short comment. I've mentioned some examples of things we do, but let me be clear. We need to do more. We're not doing enough. So we need to step up every day, and we all do. And I think in this transition, it's imperative that private capital also comes in and plays its part, where it is extremely important to have the support also for governments is in the transition and with the costs associated with the technology development and the role of the first movers. Because I don't think that private companies should have a first mover advantage. What's imperative is to secure that the first movers don't have a first mover disadvantage.
So a bit of the different actors that Yara work with, different stakeholders, actors. What would you like to see in the future to enhance your agenda even more?
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to see continued high expectations on us as a company, because governments and other stakeholders should put high expectations on us and expect that we are transparent, both about what we're good at and what we're not good at. Then I think the regulatory environment is absolutely crucial. I think if I was to pinpoint two things, it would be, number one, to have a significant acceleration of the build-out of renewable energy. And secondly, to have a very conscious strategy on making sure that Europe doesn't transition its past energy dependency into a food dependency on others than itself, primarily.
There's a question here from the audience that I'd like to take before we end, and that's, have you seen examples of government interventions in local fertilizer markets? Governments intervene in local fertilizer markets.
All the time. That's a very complicated and complex agenda, and I think we have done mistakes both on donor side and national government's sides. But we see in countries like Malawi, for example, where basically if you touch fertilizer subsidies, you lose the elections. We see many examples of that. So we have to think smart on how to, and we are in close dialogues through our embassies in countries where we have projects on food security to see, how can we reform this to use to make sure that the farmers get what they need, but at the same time doing it in a way that reforms the food system in a sustainable way.
Great. And with that, thank you so much for this session. I know that there'll be many questions. I hope you can stay a little bit longer. We'll move straight into the next session. Thank you so much to the two of you. Thank you. Round of applause. Thank you. Allow me now to welcome Wolfgang Buchner to stage. Buchner is the Director General of Agriculture and Rural Development in the European Union, a Doctor of Law with a long career within the European Union. Austrian by birth, Wolfgang Buchner will be speaking on the CAP 21, the Common Agricultural Policy 2021, Sustainability versus Sufficient Food Production. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Minister, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Now, the topic that you have asked today, productivity versus sustainability, I think Lars, the Executive Vice President of Yara, has already replied to it. We need to achieve both productivity and sustainability. The Minister has referred to the forthcoming COP27 conference that starts next week. And again, we will hear how important the contribution of agriculture is if we want to have economies that are working within the planetary boundaries. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, agriculture contributes to these developments, and there is no doubt that both in Europe but also on the worldwide level, we have to have a more sustainable agriculture. At the same time, Minister, you have referred to the fact, and FAO figures confirm it, that the level and the number of people that are starving and are suffering from hunger is increasing. And the challenge which we have as a policymaker, how can we, on the one hand, ensure sustainable agricultural production, which normally is perceived as being less productive, with the need of having additional food to the world. That is the challenge. Now, in the European Union, we have made a clear decision. And we think that the way ahead for our society is that we must become more sustainable in all our activities, including agriculture. And the Green Deal and the different strategies that we have developed, one is farm to fork, the other one is biodiversity strategy, really head to a greener common agricultural policy. Now, we are working on two strands when we want to make our agricultural policy more sustainable, but at the same time productive. On the one hand, we are working with incentives for farmers, because do not underestimate the changes which we require from farmers if you want them to produce more sustainable. This is not negligible. They have to change many of their traditions and ways how they have produced food. So we are working with financial incentives, but we are also working with a regulatory framework. Now let me start what we have done in terms of financial support to the common agricultural policy. You might know we have a budget for the next 7 years of about 400 billion euros. Part of this budget is dedicated to ensure that farmers have a safe income, mainly through direct payments, in average about 200 euros per hectare agricultural land under production, but it's hugely dependent on the different member states, to ensure income for farmers. And we are working on a study about the drivers of food security. And there are people that do not remember that the key assurance for food security is farmers. So farmers are a key driver for food security, and better you support them to ensure food security. So I think that's the economic sustainability of our common agricultural policy. But evidently, we have also to address the sustainability in terms of environment, climate, and biodiversity. And here, 40% of the 400 billion euros are dedicated to instruments that should make the common agricultural policy more sustainable. What are these instruments? Certainly some of them are also known to your agricultural policy here in Norway. The support, the direct payment support to farmers is linked to the respect of a minimum of good agricultural and environmental conditions. You only receive the full funding of direct payments if you respect key conditions in terms of greener common agricultural policy. For example, you have to rotate your yields. You have to put aside land for nature restoration, for biodiversity. So this is one category of support which we are providing to enforce our green agenda. And on the other hand, we are supporting farmers that do more than the legal requirements would ask them to do through so-called eco-schemes and agri-environmental measures. So I'm convinced that the new common agricultural policy, which we put in place at the moment that I'm speaking, because we are approving the so-called national strategic plans of all member states, who now translate these requests in terms of environmental, climate, and biodiversity challenges into their legislation. Again, this is asking a lot from our farmers' community, but this is what we need to do to render our policy more sustainable. At the same time, and that is an issue that is presently under discussion, we are also advancing on a legislative agenda, where we are asking not necessarily from the agricultural side, but from environment, from public health side, farmers to do more in terms of giving land back to nature, in terms of biodiversity, to reduce pesticides in terms of pesticide reduction, but also in terms of other emissions. And it is true that now stakeholders who, after the proposals of the European Commission, are supposed to deal with these items, do have a very careful look at these legislative proposals, because some of them feel that in times of crisis, there are limits of what you can ask farmers in terms of additional efforts to provide sustainability. So indeed, we are facing now, with respect to these initiatives, some questions relating to, have you considered what the impact of these proposals is on food security? There is an element which I think is quite decisive in our discussions. We are discussing this issue of productivity versus sustainability. And there are many voices, and I think I've heard it also here today, that in principle there is sufficient food, but it's in the wrong places, it's not well distributed. And when we are discussing about food security, I hear voices that say, yeah, but on the other hand, there is so much food loss. We could change our consumer behavior. We could eat more balanced diets, which would address some of the challenges which we are facing in terms of food security. And we could use new technologies, breeding techniques, to produce more. I think all this is right and has the potential to address the productivity issue. But I think we also need to be aware, and you have talked about this, it requires speed. I've been working in research and innovation before, and one of the key challenges is indeed the deployment of research and innovation until each and every farmer across the world uses these new findings. And this takes time. So the same is true for food loss. How many times have we tried, or since when do we try to address this? It takes time. The same for changes in consumer behavior. Today, 58% of Europeans are eating animal proteins. Now, in terms of having a more balanced diet, we should change this. But again, it will take time. So I think we have all the tools to ensure that our more sustainable production will also provide sufficient and appropriate food. But there is a transition, I think, which we have to cover well. And that brings me to the question, what does the European Commission do now to address the very difficult situation in which we are facing now? So my message is very clear. There is no alternative to having more sustainable agricultural production. The biggest enemy for farming and for food production is indeed climate change and loss of biodiversity. So I think we have to address it. But as I indicated, we are, at the moment that we are sitting here, we have an issue of food security. Last year or this year, the discussion was that we are missing 25 million tons of wheat from Ukraine. Who is coming in to provide these 25 million tons? The time it takes to have the food loss addressed, the time it takes to have the new techniques in place, might not be at this very moment. So how did we react in the European Commission? Firstly, I think it is very clear that the question of food security is not necessarily an issue of the European Union. I think thanks to our farmers, to our policy, to the single market, we have sufficient food for our citizens. Also, there is an issue of affordability. We have an inflation rate of about 15% in food production. But I think it's not only about food security in Europe. Europe has also a global role to play, or a global responsibility in terms of worldwide food security. And there I would fully agree with the minister that the key objective and target which we need to address is resilience of farming across the world, in all places. This requires all our efforts in terms of support, financial support, support in terms of research and innovation, in making available best practices and so on. And I think there things become already more complicated. It also requires humanitarian support, because they are starving now. So you have to provide food to the rest of the world. And here the question evidently comes also in about providing financial support to these countries. Now, I think on the global side, we are working on these elements, and I can't just agree then with the minister that multilateral efforts are widespread from the United Nations over the COP27, over OECD. Everybody deals with these issues of food security, but cooperation has become more complicated. But the issues are resilience and humanitarian support. Now, what did we do for Europe? And I think here partly these are measures which I understand are also known to the Norwegian agricultural policy. Firstly, it is about supporting farmers for the increased input prices in terms of energy, in terms of fertilizer. And I think we have taken crisis measures in this respect, but we have also addressed the possibility that member states might provide state aid to farmers, but also to the, in particular, fertilizer producing industry. The point that we are working, on which we are presently working, is indeed, as you have indicated, is the situation with respect to fertilizer, where the Commission has committed itself to come forward with a communication on the 9th November, which will look at these different elements, how we can address globally, but also within the European Union, the question of shortages of availability of fertilizer. In the short term, evidently also the question arises, have we exploited all the possibilities to produce food in Europe? And there immediately you are in a kind of difficult situation, because if you further increase your productivity potential, this might be in contradiction to other policy objectives, in particular relating to sustainability. And in terms of short-term measures, you remember that the European Commission has decided this summer that one element of the CAP reform, which is to put aside agricultural land for reasons of biodiversity, should be put on hold for 1 year to ensure, in particular, production of wheat. Now, this gives you an example of these difficult trade-offs in the short term between, on the one hand, producing food, and on the other hand, of respecting biodiversity. I think it's difficult to discuss or judge such policy decisions, whether they are right or wrong. They are extremely difficult, they are extremely complicated, and I think it's also a sign of a democratic society at the end that we are able, even in terms of crisis, to look at different trade-offs which, in terms of policy making, are necessary here and then. It's also true that we should not abuse the situation, the difficult situation in terms of agriculture production and food security, to make easy gains, to delay reforms, to do the necessary things which we are supposed to do. I think that is a point where we have to be extremely careful, and we need to be committed to our agenda, but at the same time, I think we need to listen carefully to our stakeholders as to what is digestible for them in terms of crisis. So I think this is what I wanted to share with you. From the European Union, from the European Commission, we are convinced that the Green Deal, farm to fork and biodiversity are at the core of our policy agenda, and we will continue to work on this agenda. At the same time, we are ready to listen and to look at challenges that the world is facing, but also our stakeholders are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Director General Wolfgang Buchner for those remarks. You'll have a chance to join me later for the Q&A session in a little while. But now, let me introduce Palle Borgström, who was elected president of the Federation of Swedish Farmers, LRF, in May 2017. Palle Borgström runs a farm, as a farmer. Runs a farm with arable crops and milk production situated north of Gothenburg in Sweden. Palle will be giving us a farmer's perspective on the CAP21. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I might take the liberty to broaden that scope a little bit more than just the CAP21. First of all, farmers are necessary for society to handle both all the climate challenges that we have, but also to safeguard and secure food supply and food security. And I think the theme of my intervention here could also be, has the Commission provided farmers with the tools so they can actually fulfill both those objectives? And I might make the distinction between the part of the Commission that Mr. Butcher is working with, which we have a very good collaboration with, and on the other side, the political part of the European Commission, which we may not always agree with. So there's quite a difference there. But don't get me wrong, farmers are necessary for society and for food security and also for sustainability. There's no way around that. The CAP reform that is now hitting the farmers in Europe here 1st of January 2023, the process of forming that is actually history. And I don't think it's necessary to go into details. The very short conclusion about it is that there are more flexibility for member states and more flexibility for farmers. There are higher targets and higher demands on farmers, but there's also less money in the system. So you could ask the question if the Commission actually provides or enable for farmers to do what they have to do. I think the profitability with the farmers are actually keeping them down and restricting the investments that we have to do to increase efficiency in the food production. But the CAP has a long history. It goes back 60 years, and you often hear a lot of criticism around the common agriculture policy. From farmers, they think that it's not enough money in it and there's too much obligations. You hear it from politicians. They think it's too expensive, take up too much of the European budget. And we hear it from the NGOs, especially from the environmental NGOs, that the CAP is not green enough. I think it's fair to once in a while remind yourself about what's the basic objectives with the common agriculture policy and what have we achieved with it. I think there are, if you look outside Europe in the world, there are two basic principles for an agriculture policy. There is the one that Switzerland and Japan and Norway have, which is quite protective to the domestic market. It has high targets, but also gives farmers a possibility to actually meet consumers' expectations on high quality food, high environmental concern and sustainability measures, and also respect consumers' different demand for different types of food. I think that policy ticks all these boxes, but you can question if it makes food affordable. The other principle is the free trade, market-based way of producing food that we see in North America and South America, that makes farmers extremely productive and efficient. But it also disconnects farmers from the connection to the consumers. Farmers are seen as commodity producers, and there's no room in these type of agriculture policies for extra environmental measures or sustainability measures. So I think actually the European way of the common agriculture policy is taking the best of both these and form it into a policy where we can, and we can prove that we have increased productivity in agriculture. It ensures at least a fair standard of living for farmers, even if we know that the average income for farmers in the European Union is lower than the average income in the rest of society. It stabilizes markets, and it guarantees food security. 60 years ago, when the CAP was introduced, Europe was an importer of food. Now we are an exporter. But at the same time as we have increased production and made Europe to a supplier to the rest of the world, we can also meet consumers' demand for environmental friendly produced products, sustainably friendly produced products, high animal welfare, low use of antibiotics. I know that Sweden, inside the European Union, is the country with the lowest use of antibiotics in the animal production. And I know if we compare to Europe that Norway is a little bit better than Sweden, but it's an inch of improvement. So. But we have something to learn from you here. So. But it also ensures affordable prices for food for consumers. And so I think the CAP this far is actually, even if you hear all this criticism around, the CAP is a success. But if we look at the future and what we see, the proposed measures from the Commission that comes out in the farm to fork strategy, I think you could raise the question if the political side of the Commission actually have recognized that the world has changed. We see a lot of those measures proposed that came from the Commission in early 2020 that will be contradictory to the goal of also securing food security, both for the people of Europe, but also for the people outside Europe. The farm to fork includes 50% reduction in plant protection products, 20% reduction of fertilizer, with the goal of reducing nutrient leakage with 50%. Putting 25% of the agricultural land into organic production, taking 10% of the European farmland out of production for biodiversity measures. And all these, we have asked the Commission for impact assessments on what the consequences will be on this. First of all, we heard nothing from the Commission when it comes to impact assessments, so we had to rely of these impact assessments from other sources. USDA made one, the University of Kiel in Germany made one, the Wageningen University in the Netherlands made one, and finally we got one from the Joint Research Center from the European Commission. All those impact assessments, they point in the same direction, that if you introduce those measures, that production will go down between 10 and 20% in Europe, prices will go up with 20 to 40%. And those impact assessments, they ended there. But if we look at what's happening to our society now, I think what we see now is a reality check of what will be the consequences of those measures. It's for different reasons now, but the outcome and the result of it will be the same. Now we see a decrease in production and we see higher prices because of what we all know what's happening in the world. First, the inflation on costs coming out of the pandemic and the disturbance of supply chain that we saw there, but also now the effect of the war in Ukraine. And I think it's quite obvious that what we see, what's impacting our society now with high inflation, economy going into recession, higher interest rates, is a reality check of what will be the impact of the farm to fork measures. And we need to see different measures from the Commission that allows the European farmers to do what needs to be done, both for environmental and sustainability, but at the same time as we can keep on producing and supplying both the European population but also consumers outside of Europe with food. So we need different measures. For example, we need measures that we can do good for biodiversity at the same time as we produce on that land, not taking land out of production. From a farmer's perspective and from the LRF and Copa Cochica in Brussels, we don't think that the political side of the Commission has actually recognized that the world has changed and their old measures, they won't work in the new environment that we work in. So I think to sum this up, it goes both into that farmers need to do a lot of investments for make the food production more sustainable, especially on mitigating climate change. They need the financial capability to do those investments, and we need probably a different business model in the food chain. Farmers, if you look at it in Europe, for every euro that the consumer spends, 9 cents goes back to the farmer. The rest stops in the chain from the farmer to the consumers. The retailers, first of all, the government takes a bit of that in tax, but the retailers have a very high margin, very high compared to the risk they're taking in their business, compared to the risk that farmers take in their business and the margins of farmers. So we need a different model that we can get those money from the consumers direct to the farmer. We know that fertilizer produced without any impact on, or fossil-free fertilizer will be twice the price. If we can put that price to the consumer without every part of the chain putting on their margins, it won't be that much more expensive for consumers. But if everyone in that chain, the processing industry and the retailers and the government should take their share out of it, the price will probably be too high. So we need to see different measures. I heard the former president of the World Farmers Organization, he once said that farmers need peace, but peace also need farmers. I think that's a very good conclusion. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Palle, for that. We're just expecting tables up, and I'll invite Borchner as well to join us here. Let's see, there'll be another table just arriving here. Sorry about that.
Can still be around the same table.
Can you, yes, I was.
Of course.
I was going to ask that question. Are you comfortable with this, or should we find a third table up here?
I think that's very important that we can be that. Even if we have some different views on things.
That's a perfect.
Always in a democracy important that you keep on the discussion.
Wonderful. That's. Do you agree to that?
Certainly.
Absolutely. So we have a good start now of a discussion. Now you very different views here of the situation, and you asked for more policies, different policies. How do you answer to that, Buchner?
Firstly, I'm not so convinced that we are so divergent in our analysis of the situation. Firstly, Bali has referred to all the different studies in terms of what would the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork mean in terms of production. And I think also the European Commission has contributed to this, and you have referred to the joint research study, and I think Bali was right by quoting that these studies, by and large, foresee 10 to 20% reduction based on different economic models. But it is also true that we have put into question these studies because we felt that these studies, based on models, do not take into account developments that might mitigate the effect of reduction of production. And this is the point I wanted to make. This study on the reduction of production does not take into account what you can do in terms of research and innovation, in terms of fertilizer reduction, in terms of agroecology, in terms of new breeding techniques. All this research side might partly compensate for possible losses of productivity. It might not be synchronized in terms of that the losses might occur before the effects of new technologies and research take place. But I think in principle, this was one of the elements. The other one was, what does it matter if food production is reduced if at the same time we reduce food loss? I think is a fair question. So I think these discussions have taken place around the adoption of the Farm to Fork strategy. But I would agree with Bali on some points, which is, firstly, we have often the tendency to play nature against agricultural activity. And I have seen agricultural activities in mountain pastures, and probably it's not very different in your place, where both things can perfectly coexist without doing harm to nature, even increasing biodiversity. Evidently, it depends about the degree of extensivity. And I think there is an issue which we certainly need work to further together, also in the context of the nature restoration law. So I think, by and large, and also on the changes of the policy, I still am convinced that our mid and long-term perspective of making our policy greener is the right thing. But I think we have also shown in the short term, and our political leaders, that they are ready, if there is a need, to come back on some of their decisions. And this is why I quoted this decision, which was not an easy one, in the first year of the reform, to not apply the rule that 4% of your agricultural land should be put aside. So I would not be as pessimistic.
You'll get a chance to respond to that in a while, and we'll get back to Farm to Fork in just a little while. But I want to ask you first, both of you, this winter Europe has experienced, or is experiencing, an energy crisis, mainly because of the sensitivity of the gas market due to new geopolitical context and the war in Ukraine. What is the European Commission doing to ensure sectors such as food and fertilizer production to get access to gas in case of shortages? And how does the European Commission want to support farmers who face increased costs, energy, fertilizers, etc., costs on these issues? Would you like to start off? I mean, the question is to you, and I'll invite you for reactions afterwards.
I think I can be very short on this point. On the one hand, we have already in March 2022 made use of the so-called crisis reserve, which is amongst our budget 500 million euros that can be used for crisis reserves, and member state could add another 1 billion. So 1.5 million were available in terms of crisis reserve. And this was money that member state could provide funding to the farmers that were most concerned about the Ukraine crisis, which at the end was in particular livestock farming, because they suffered most from the increased intrant prices. Arable crop farmers got a good compensation through the high prices of the end product. At the same time, we have also increased the level that member states can provide state aid to their farmers. This is an issue that does not exist in Norway because there is no such frame. So in that sense, public support for farmers is possible, whereas in European Union, because we have a common policy, there is a limit, but we have really increased these limits, and I think we are just deciding again to increase the level of state aid that can be granted to a farm to about, I do not know exactly now whether I can say it because I'm not sure that it was adopted, but it will be considerably higher
We'll get back to you.
it was in the past. So I think we do provide support to farmers.
Any reactions to that?
I think it's important to say and recognize that we see so many changes at the moment and uncertainties that we haven't seen before. I read an article for a while discussing the difference between risk and uncertainty. Sometimes in our daily talk we think that's the same, but the conclusion of that article was that risk is something that you can measure, judge, and you can manage it. Uncertainty is something different, and what we see now and is profound uncertainty. And I think it's also important to recognize that with the mismatch we see on energy markets for the moment in Europe, for example, there's no way that the Commission can come up with policy measures that will offset that mismatch. And I know that we have groups of farmers who think that throughout Europe in different countries, think that if we just put enough pressure on the Commission, they will fix it and they will make it possible for farmers to just continue the way we have been used to and what we've done before. That is not going to happen.
Back to the farm to fork, the EU farm to fork. There's been a lot of discussions about the negative impacts that the ambitions of the EU farm to fork strategy have had or would have on European farming and productivity. These concerns are now being reiterated by many stakeholders as global food security is worsening, so worsening of the two factors. Is there a risk that the EU farm to fork in some years may cause a similar crisis with reduced food production?
I think so. And of course there will be mitigating things in innovation and development that can help farmers reach those targets. But what the Commission is doing is that they are taking tools out of the farmer's toolbox without replacing them now, maybe sometimes in the future. For take one example, we can probably reduce our dependency on plant protection products if we introduce the new breeding techniques in CRISPR-Cas, for example. But the Commission, they don't take that decision, so they take our tools, but they're not putting something else in the farmer's toolbox. That will lead to decreased production of food in Europe. When the farm to fork was presented, the communication from the Commission was that it doesn't matter if we reduce our production in Europe, we can also decrease our export, or we can decrease our energy production on farmland. Both of that will be very bad ideas at the moment with what we are experiencing.
May I just on these points, because they are very important points. I think in the food communication from March, food security communication, which we have adopted, it was made clear that we have a geopolitical and humanitarian responsibility to produce food not only for Europe, but also contribute to the world, in despite of the fact that we have to ensure in the first place resilience there. But there is a clear commitment, and this summer, or by the end of this year, we will have exported 35 million tons of wheat that will be also available to countries around the Mediterranean and to South Sahel. So I think we are committed to this role, that we have also to play a role on a worldwide sector. On the question of the decrease, 15%, it's a lot. If you just look at these models without taking into consideration other aspects. But what will happen if we have no pollinators, if the soil quality is so bad, if we have no water? Look at maize this summer. It's not our policy that has led to production of maize by 20%. It's not us. It's not our green policy that has reduced it 20%. It was the climate. So I think we need to get our enemies right. And the main thing is, the biggest risk is environmental and climate and biodiversity degradation. Maybe not this year and next year, but it will play. So, and I think Palle and the farmers are certainly arguing or agreeing on this. The question is the speed and the depth of changes which we are discussing here. And Palle has made reference to this pesticide directive or regulation now, which indeed, firstly, at this point is a proposal of the European Commission, where the democratic decision-making process has just started with involving the European Parliament and the member states. So evidently there is a potential to reconsider these objectives in a democratic process, and I refer to it. We have carefully listened to the voices that have been issued in this respect. It's also a question, Palle has referred, do we have alternatives? We are reducing high risk pesticides. Do we have, thanks to research and innovation, alternatives, either in terms of other products or production methods that can reduce the risks that you have if you have less pesticide? So I think all these things we need to discuss now, but
you don't know it, but you are creating quite a few questions online here.
Very good.
Palle is not surprised, I can see that. And that's why we're here, right? To create the questions and hopefully get some answers.
People should have the same questions than we have to discuss every day, because
let's see.
Replies.
We have a few minutes left, so we won't get through all, but I'd like to take some of them. Now, one question here, and I think it's for the two of you. We'll see how you react to it. This last summer, we saw a large protests among farmers in the Netherlands due to the so-called nitrogen crisis. Are you not afraid that the new CAP strategic plans, combined with additional regulations currently under negotiations, for example, the nature restoration law or the soil health law, can go beyond what farmers are ready to accept? Let me start here.
Yes. As I said, I think in the context of the common agricultural policy, we mainly work with incentives. If a farmer goes beyond the legal requirements, he gets a compensation. So I think nobody questions this, and this is what we do in the national strategic plans. Now the question is, should we have above and in addition to incentives also a common regulatory framework for everybody in Europe to address the challenges which I have asked? And there is in particular the issue of nitrate. And this is not an innocent issue, because nitrate has huge consequences of the quality of our water. And there are places in Europe, hotspots, which constitute a reputational risk for the common agricultural policy, because not all agricultural policy is creating problems. But there are places where we have a huge intensity of animals compared to the little land that is available. And it was even the Dutch authorities, not necessarily us, who have decided we cannot afford this anymore. So what is wrong in this? That we look in particular in those places where the governance model is really not necessarily the one which we would like to have for our future.
But as I said in the beginning, farmers are prepared to do their share of the work for mitigating climate change and taking care of the environment. This is not about that we argue that farmers shouldn't do nothing. This is about doing the right measures. That means that we can combine mitigating climate change, environmental impact, and food security. And I'm quite sure that there are some areas in Europe where we have very intense production with a high impact on the local or the regional environment, that the production should be reduced. But it's important that the measures that we see from the Commission reflect the different conditions in the different member states and the different parts of Europe.
Okay. Another question here, which is more bringing it home to Norway. Let's see if we can challenge you on this one. Norway is importing a lot of feed stuff from Europe, wheat and rape. Should Norway be worried about the farm to fork, or will Europe still be an exporting area of grains in the future?
Sweden is always there to support you.
Sweden is always there.
Maybe we can trade it with some
MS, we'll note that down.
We are prepared to trade it with some fertilizer.
Well, you have the minister, at least one minister in the room. You have, people in the room who might be able to join the negotiations. But hey, what do you say? Or what would you say?
No, indeed, this is a very pertinent question, because it's in particular, I need to be a little bit longer, but it's important, because in particular, livestock production in Europe is hugely challenged. And I think, and why do they challenge it? Because there are people, if they see a cattle, they have two things in their mind. It produces methane, and there is a correlation between red meat and cancer. And I think this is not fair towards the cow. Because she produces much more in terms of benefits for society. It's about maintenance of rural areas. It's about biodiversity, if it's done in an extensive manner. It has a potential for carbon capturing. But the fact is that livestock has an extremely bad reputation in terms of health issues, balanced diet, and in terms of methane emissions. And I invite you, there has just been a declaration of scientists about livestock farming, the so-called Dublin Declaration, which recognizes these challenges, but also sees the positive sides of it. Why do I talk about this? Because there are two discussions. Firstly, we import too much feed from the rest of the world to the detriment of climate and environment in these places. You all know the discussion about the Amazonian forests that are used to produce soja or whatever for feeding our animals. And I think the Commission has just taken the deliberate action in this respect, and discussions are going on the Council. Now, we are ready to say, but then let us grow the feed for the animals in Europe so that we can also export to Norway. But then, no, people say, no, this is not possible either, because you should not have so many animals. We are discussing now, next year the Commission is supposed to come forward with a so-called framework law of sustainable food. Now we receive already stakeholders' contributions. One request is to reduce livestock in Europe by half. Can someone explain me why? Now, I accept that in certain intensive places you need to reduce it. But as long as we have enough pastures and grass to feed the cattle here in Europe, why should I? Maybe because of health issues, I do not know. But then let us discuss what is a good balance between vegetable proteins and animal proteins. So we are looking into these issues because people think we have 157 million hectares of agricultural land in Europe. out of which 50 million is grassland. What shall you do on the grassland except feeding animals? Then they think all the rest, arable land, again, should be used for food and not for feed. But not all arable land can be used for food. It can be of bad quality. You can only produce wheat, again, for exporting to maybe Norway. So what I want to say is things are much more complex than just throw some points in the discussion. We need less livestock without looking on the consequences on our place.
But to give a short, maybe a bit more serious answer, I don't think it's the farmers of Norway and Sweden or the consumers that we should be concerned about. We will have the purchase power even if the price go up a bit. It's the people living in North Africa and Eastern Africa that will be left behind and not our part of the world.
Bergström, how do we get farmers on board in our common challenges linked to Europe's Green Deal? And how do we get them on board when it comes to transforming European Union agriculture and the whole food system? How do we get the farmers on board?
By proposing measures that are reflecting all the challenges and not only a part of that.
So new measures, other measures, stronger measures?
Less
measures?
I think
more measures?
We should also look at what's happening beside that political landscape. A lot of things when it comes to sustainability happens through consumer demand and what demand the processing factories are putting on farmers. I think actually we're moving more on that landscape than we do on the political landscape, and we're moving faster. We see a lot of initiatives, and we see also a lot of work that farmers do, I would say, voluntary or together with advisory services, and especially in our part of Europe, we have actually come a long way by those voluntary measures.
Palle Bergström and Wolfgang Büsche, thank you so much for having this nice discussion here today and not getting into a fist fight yet. Thank you.
Maten som produseres i Norge variert og av høy kvalitet. Den norske bonden produserer blant annet de fleste ingrediensene på tacobordet. FN understreker at alle land må produsere mer mat til egen befolkning. Dette viktig for å kunne fø verden i fremtiden. I usikre tider det viktigere enn noen gang at vi tar vare på og videreutvikler det norske landbruket.
Vi bør være litt nøye på at vi produserer mat til eget folk. Jeg synes det viktig.
Jeg tror ikke alle skal dyrke alt i hver kommune. Vi må se Norge som helhet, og at Norge kortreist.
Alle som kan produsere mat, bør produsere mat etter beste evne så mye de kan.
Altså, vi har en norsk andel på løk på ca. 80-85%. Det ganske bra.
Jeg vil at tacolefsa skal være laget av hvetemel.
Jeg føler jo selv en viktig jobb, og jeg håper jo at folk setter pris på det vi gjør. Og vi skal jo levere kvalitet. Vi skal jo det. Det jo det vi vil.
Welcome back after the break to those in the room and to those online as well. A quick reminder that you can submit questions as we go into new Q&A afterwards via the link that was sent to you. If you told us that you were joining, there was an email that was sent out on Friday, or you can go into yara.no to submit your questions there. And we have more speakers and more topics and more discussions. No more fist fights, but there will be discussions. Next up on stage is Josef Schmidhuber. Josef Schmidhuber is Deputy Director at the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, of the United Nations. Currently works at the Trade and Markets Division, at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And Josef does research in resource economics, agriculture 4.0, nutrition, climate change, as well as trade and trade policies in food and agriculture products. Josef Schmidhuber will be speaking on food prices at all times highs. At all times high. Are farmers sharing in the benefits? There you go. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction, and thanks to the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to listen to the discussions. I learned a lot, and I hope I can still learn a lot in the rest of the day. So this is essentially a presentation that doesn't directly deal with food security, and you're probably used to that by listening to FAO. It's really something about food prices, and actually food prices from two perspectives. Starting with consumers, you don't see this here in the title, and then gradually moving into the producers. So the title only covers part of the presentation. And it is in a way, I got the perfect segue from Minister Twinheim, because she essentially said very eloquently and elegantly that the problem today is, and that's really a big difference to 2008, is that prices for consumers are really high, and consumers are facing enormous challenges accessing the food market. And at the same time, and it's really different from 2008, the input prices for producers are very high. And that essentially means that farmers are increasingly disenchanted because they find it hard to actually meet positive margins, to have positive margins, to have incentives to produce. It, of course, depends on what we are talking about, what region it is, and what production area it is. But we have these twin challenges today. And it could really mean, and that's the last slide of the presentation eventually, it could really mean that we are moving away from an access crisis, a cost of living crisis, and that's what we have today. We don't have an availability crisis, towards an availability crisis next year. I'm not saying we will, but I would like to make a few arguments that we could. So let me start with a brief overview. So as said already, I will start with the high food prices from the perspective of consumers. And I don't need to go into the various points that I will address. I will do that then. In the second part, I will try to address the perspective of producers and eventually wrap up. Good. So what is the current market situation? And as you certainly know, FAO is monitoring food prices in a very detailed way, and food prices were at the new record high, at least in nominal terms, in March this year. They have been falling ever since, as we can see here. Unfortunately, I don't have a laser beamer, but you see that anyway rather clearly. So in March, we reached a new all-time high at least in nominal terms. A good economist would never show a time series in nominal terms. It would always need to be deflated. And I come back to this because it's really important to understand how to deflate a time series. It can mean completely different things. On the right side, you see essentially what are the contributing elements to this all-time high, and we clearly see that this is mainly on account of prices for vegetable oil, which shot up due to a number of actually policy interventions, for instance, the export ban by Indonesia, but then also the high costs faced in Malaysia due to high labor costs and disrupted supply chains. And of course, we know that the two countries account for 80% of palm oil exports, and that is a big element in global palm oil prices. We also see that cereal prices went up, and that's actually the jump due to the war in Ukraine. They came down. They may actually go up a little. I would not expect that it's a lot due to the discontinuation of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but we could see more price action there. The other prices are actually relatively well behaved, although they're also up, sugar and meat and dairy. All of this is in nominal terms, and we will see in a moment how important it is to actually deflate that time series. Why? In a moment, I will show you one of the key price elements for agriculture, and that is the energy market. So looking at the energy markets, we actually see something that we haven't seen in 30 years. So that's a long, long time series, and that's the price for natural gas. And this volatility is really unprecedented. Natural gas prices went up enormously. TTF prices by the end of August this year were at 350 euros per megawatt hour. and they came down in the space of just 2 months by 70%, so below 100 euros per megawatt hour. So that volatility is unprecedented. And we still see that prices are above the long-term average. And they have clearly departed from the oil prices here represented by the WTI, the West Texas Intermediate price. So these prices are not only important for producers, but they're very important for food consumers because they have to pay the heating of the houses. And they are important for processors, including Yara, of course, because that's the key feedstock for nitrogen fertilizer. And they are obviously very important for producers because this means higher prices for diesel. It means higher prices for gas, like, for instance, in the Netherlands for greenhouse producers. And it means generally higher prices for all sorts of things, diesel, etc., etc. So how big is the burden for consumers? And of course, our main concern is always food security, and we always look first at the burden for consumers, and we see here essentially how big the share of food expenditure in total expenditure is in a number of countries. And it's really enormous. I know we are always concerned about food inflation in our countries, that food accounts for a very high share of total income, but this is nothing compared to many developing countries where food can account for 50% and more, up to 80, 90% of total income. And it's clear that if one pays that much amount of money for food, very little is left over for other things. And how little is left over is, you will see that on the next slide when we actually add to food also energy and housing. So that's essentially here. And there we see that a lot of countries, I think here these are 30 countries, essentially spend more than 60% of their total income on these basic necessities. And actually that number has risen to 53 countries in just the space of 2 years, and it's probably much higher now. It's probably around 70 countries. So clearly this is a cost of living crisis, and it's well illustrated here. Good. So what I illustrated here for the individual consumers, of course, becomes manifest also at the macro level. When we look into the import bills for food, then we also notice they're at all-time highs. And they have been soaring in the past. They have been soaring enormously, not only for the world as a whole. This is not necessarily our focus. Our focus is always the lower and middle income countries. And so just in the space of 1 year, they increased by 26%. So these countries are spending a lot more for their food imports. And that also illustrates the real problem of the food crisis. We just had an off-site discussion about this. What is the current food crisis? It is not an availability crisis. Actually, the world is producing enormous amounts of food. We have record production for wheat. We have record production for rice. We have record stocks for wheat and rice. We have very good production for coarse grains. So you ask yourself, if we have all these, if the world is awash in grain, if the world is awash in food, so why do we have these high prices? Well, because there are countries that are essentially able to siphon off any additional supply at relatively high prices. I don't want to zero in on any country, but perhaps to illustrate it just with the example of the biggest importer in the world, that's China. China has been the biggest importer in 2019, in January, and has doubled since then its agricultural imports. So what's happening is essentially that these big importers are pricing these smaller countries out of the market. And so the problem that we have at the moment is not a general availability problem. The problem that we have is that some countries simply don't have the purchasing power to access the market. And this is actually why FAO has come up with a food import financing facility. We call it the FIF. And now we are very happy that the IMF has picked up the idea and has opened a food shock window, as it's called. And I learned on Friday last week that the first $80 million went to Malawi that help essentially Malawi to import food. So we knew all of this from the beginning. We analyzed the situation, I think, correctly, and that's why we proposed that. Good. Let me now move to the producers. So prices are at all-time highs, and I said already, a good economist would never look at a nominal price series, particularly not if it is over such a long period of time. good economists would always deflate. And of course, the FAO, we are good economists, we deflate. The problem here is that we deflated perhaps with the wrong deflator. It has always been good to deflate the nominal series as far as commodities are concerned with what we call the manufactured unit value. So this is essentially a basket of good that reflects the cost of an importer that imports machinery, that imports consumer electronics, that imports cars, that imports manufacturers. And so this actually allows a country to say, how are my terms of trade evolving for the commodities I'm exporting? Simply put, how much cars and how many tractors, how many consumer electronics can I buy for the soybeans I'm exporting? Now that is, from a terms of trade perspective, a very valid question. But it doesn't answer the question that farmers are asking themselves, is it actually so that I can buy more fertilizer, can buy more pesticides, seeds, feeds, etc. for my goods? So as you see here, in terms of real prices for farmers, that would be actually a bonanza. No, they have very good prices and they should actually have a strong incentive to produce if we deflate the series with the export unit value. But it's not true, as I said already, because farmers are facing different prices. They do not care what the stereo costs or what the car costs, or perhaps some do, but in general they care about what their inputs cost. So their fertilizer, and the fertilizers are at all-time highs. They also care about what other inputs cost. And so what we do in order to capture this, we try to deflate, for instance, the output prices with the fertilizer price. And we call this the fertilizer affordability. And you've heard about this, right? So fertilizer affordability is essentially just the output prices divided by a fertilizer index. And that's what you see here. And lo and behold, prices don't look that good in terms of fertilizer affordability. But that's just one little element of the overall basket of inputs that a farmer is facing. Farmers, of course, face a lot more inputs. They face costs of diesel, they face costs of feeds, of seeds, of pesticides, of electricity, and so on and so forth. So we took that one step further and moved away from just the fertilizer affordability to a general affordability. But before going into that, let me just show you how it looks for individual products in terms of fertilizer affordability. And there you see fertilizer affordability is actually still very low. There are some silver linings on the horizon, for instance, for maize. Well, output prices are relatively good, and now we see a contraction in urea prices, so it's actually improving. That could actually mean that maize production becomes more profitable again, and that's a good sign. It's quite different, for instance, for palm oil, where, okay, urea is not such a big deal, but still, if we just look at it from an arithmetic perspective, with this precipitous fall in palm oil prices, affordability has not improved. Good. Let's move away from just looking into one input into a series of inputs. And so we constructed an input price index, which is certainly not complete, but it's the information that was available to us. And that input price index has 5 components. It's total energy in agriculture, that's electricity, it's diesel, etc., etc. So it's all the fuels, it's all the feeds, which is a very important component, particularly for the livestock producers. And I think Mr. Burcher has already mentioned that the livestock producers are in a very rough spot at the moment because they are facing not necessarily higher output prices, quite the opposite, particularly for pig and poultry producers, but they are facing enormous increases in their feed costs and hence lower margins, or some even negative margins. A lot of pig producers are going out of production because the prices for their feeds have risen faster than the prices for their pigs. It also includes fertilizer as an important component, pesticides and seed. And the weighting is not by trade, it's actually by consumption. So it's quite important to get a consumption-based index. And if we now take the same series and we deflate it with the input price index, we get a different result. Before doing that, we thought at the global level it's actually useful to distinguish between 2 different input price index. One that includes all the inputs that are produced by agriculture and the other one that doesn't. Why? And what are the inputs produced by agriculture? The seeds and the feeds are actually produced by agriculture. So if you take the sector as a whole and the world as a whole, it doesn't make sense to include these 2 into the basket of goods inputs for agriculture because they actually come out of agriculture. Just as agriculture as a whole. But the moment we move down either into a country or we move down into a specific sector, this net GP doesn't make any sense. So we have to then move into the gross GP that includes seeds and feeds. Okay, so we see already, because of the enormous increase, particularly in the energy market, and particularly in the electricity market, and there are, particularly in Europe, sectors in agriculture that are very intensive as far as their energy consumption is concerned, this can be a major threat to profitability. So the input price index is rising much faster than, for instance, the MUV, and particularly if we only look into the energy-focused input price index. So if one then essentially takes that food price index of FAO and deflates it with the GP, the global input price index, that's the yellow line, and perhaps even with the energy-focused GP, which is of course very partial, then we see that prices are not high and rising, but they're actually falling and they're low. They're not quite as low as they were in 2008, but they're not rising. And that is exactly what the minister said. So for consumers, we do not see a relief because they're still facing the high prices. But for farmers in particular, in rural areas in more general terms, the situation isn't as rosy as it looks, simply because while they get more for the output, they pay a lot more for the inputs. And if a farmer uses a lot of energy-intensive inputs, that actually can offset much of the output. It doesn't have to. So it can still be so that the increase in the output prices way outweighs the increase in the input prices, simply when these inputs play a small role or the output prices are rising relatively rapidly. And we see that. And actually, the margins, not only the margins are high, but it could even be so that the overall returns are rising relatively rapidly. As we've seen, for instance, in the EU for wheat, everybody expected a poor crop, but it wasn't a poor crop. And so the wheat farmers benefited not only from keeping their margins, but also having more output. It's different for the maize market, which is actually more energy intensive, and at the same time, the yields were not nearly as good as it was anticipated. So again, this was the micro analysis, but we see the same at the macro level for countries as a whole. We've developed a new indicator, as it were, which we call it's a tongue twister, the input-import bill. So it's essentially the bill that developing countries in particular, but the world as a whole, is paying for imported inputs. Good, and that bill has, we saw a moment ago how the food input bill has risen. I think it was by 25 or 26%. We see now how the input bill has risen. And for the low-income countries, it has risen by 130%. So that's really, the low and low-middle-income countries has really risen by an enormous amount. And that, of course, puts additional strain on their current account balance. And that's particularly worrisome because these countries are facing a double whammy, as they say in the US. It's not only that they pay a lot more for their inputs, their exchange rate has fallen dramatically often against the US dollar. And unlike in the past, they cannot benefit from this. Why can they not benefit? In the past, it was always so, yes, you essentially depreciate yourself out of trouble by letting the exchange rate go down. And that was fine, so you gain competitiveness, particularly when the exchange rate falls beyond the inflation rate, so the relative inflation rates. We call this real depreciation. That, however, is not working to the extent it used to work because the rest of the world is not growing. So when the rest of the world is not growing, it's actually shrinking in part, you cannot use your competitiveness that you've gained through the exchange rate because nobody buys your products. And that's the trouble that many developing countries are facing now. Good. So with this, just let me wrap it up. And I see that I remain within my time limits. So as Minister Twinheim said, consumers continue to suffer from high food prices. This is particularly worrisome in countries where food and energy account for a large share of the total income and the total expenditure. When we deflate prices with the MUV, we make a mistake. I think there is no doubt about this, simply because unless we are only interested in terms of trade, simply because the MUV does not reflect the cost basket that a farmer is facing. So in order to get rid of this, we need to have a different deflator, and that's what I tried to explain. That's perhaps the academic version of something rather banal. The incentives that we normally think are now provided to farmers by high output prices are not as strong as we think. It's actually so that particularly farmers that are producing in an energy-intensive way or an input-intensive way overall, they are facing not necessarily up high and rising prices, but they're facing low and falling prices. So the big question that we now have is, with this lower affordability overall, do we move from a cost of living crisis, from an access crisis at the moment, into an availability crisis in 2023, simply because it's not as profitable as we may think it is profitable to produce agricultural outputs? And that's something we carefully watch, and we hope that this will not be the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidhuber. Thank you for staying within your time and for being so clear in your takeaways as well. You will be joining us later for the Q&A, but before that, let me welcome Sverre Alvik, Research Director, Head of Energy Transition Research at DNV GL, Det Norske Veritas, Director of DNV GL's Energy Transition Outlook, who has worked for DNV for over 20 years in Europe, Asia, and America. Please, the floor is yours, Sverre Alvik.
Thank you, and thank you for welcoming an sort of energy and an agricultural novice into an agricultural conference. But I'll try to give you the perspectives of energy into this. And let me start with a small quiz. Which is the bigger? I mean, one commonality with energy and food is that you could measure it in joule. So which one is the bigger? They're both big. If you look at the amount of energy produced in the world, it's a 5 with 20 zeros, 500 exajoule. If you look at the amount of food, and admittingly, this is the food consumed by humans. And if you add what is consumed by cattle or made into feed or others, I'm sure it's bigger, but that wasn't something I was able to calculate. But this one I could do myself with about 9,000 kilojoules per person for 7.8 billion people a day. That's 25 exajoule of food consumption. What does this tell? Of course, it's not so that producing energy is inefficient, or because the amount of energy you put onto a land for fertilizer or diesel or whatever would grow a lot when you produce food out of it. But it tells that the agriculture industry is actually a very small part of the energy industry. It's a very little part of energy that goes to fuel for agricultural use, including transport of crops around the world. And also we heard that agriculture is 30% of the world's emissions, but that's not due to the CO2 of the fuel they burn. It's due to the methane that we heard earlier here today. Anyway, both of these are big, and what is now happening is that we have a large shift because we have a war. And in most of the world, and in particular the low-income countries, as we heard from Schmidhuber here, the high energy and the food prices, they move the attention to the short-term priorities. These countries don't have time and focus to increase their pledges for the next COP meeting. They have more than enough, and they have inflation and recession on top of this for the short-term problems. In Europe, it's a little different, because Europe is doubling down on energy efficiency and renewable build-out. And they're not doing that because of the traditional reason of sustainability, but are doing it of the energy security concerns. Because energy security moved to the top priority in Europe, but luckily they pull in the same direction as energy sustainability. So when you improve efficiency, when you improve renewable build-out, you also improve security. So the war is accelerating the energy transition in Europe, but it's slowing it down in the rest of the world short term. Longer term, the war is not really the one setting the pace for the energy transition. The falling costs of renewable, the increasing carbon prices, they are still the one that decides the long-term effort and pace of the transition. But I'll come into all this in the coming 15 minutes. But historically, we have had, and we have, an energy world which is 80% fossil fuel and 20% non-fossil. Non-fossil here means 5% nuclear and 15% renewable. Up to now, we have had an energy addition, not an energy transition, because there is no electric vehicle that reduces emissions. There is no solar plant that reduce emissions. The emissions are only reduced when you remove the diesel vehicle or when you remove the coal plant, and that has not happened to date. So we had an energy addition. But from now on, we will have an energy transition where the one is replacing the other. And as we see it, most likely with the expected economic, technological, and behavioral development, we're heading towards a 50-50 mix in mid-century. So we're moving away from fossil-dominated fuel, but not into a renewable-dominated one, not for many decades still. But I'll talk a little bit now on the energy trilemma. And if there is 1 year to talk about the energy trilemma, it's this year. I mean, the energy trilemma has been here for decades. But this year, all three triangles, all three corners of the triangle has got further momentum. And let's start with security, because that's not where we traditionally started. That has been left on the back burner now in Europe for many years, and never mind warnings that we were too dependent on Russian gas or others. It felt safe and comfortable. But now this has become the #1 priority in Europe. And it's all hands on deck to ensure alternative energy from the Russian one. Do we manage? Partly. We have an energy system which cannot easily replace the Russian gas because there aren't sufficient pipelines to Europe, there aren't sufficient liquefaction or regasification terminals to make sure we could have the gas into Europe. And now we look at both legislative, economic, technological, and behavioral measures in order to ensure alternatives to this gas. And we are partly succeeding, but also we are failing in the sense that European industry, especially if it's become a cold winter, will have to suffer. You will close down industries because there aren't sufficient gas. I guess most consumers, most farmers, they will have sufficient energy. But what can you easiest shut down? The industry. And that can also is the one with most threat to move out, and it could be permanent. So Europe is doubling down on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, and long term, that will mean that you secure a much more energy independent Europe. So you will see a Europe which is producing a more share of their own energy. The other corner of the triangle is the affordability. And even before the war, we saw that the prices started to increase, but that was related to Russian strategy. And we have had the last year record high gas and electricity prices, as we saw here, but also they're currently 70% down from the all-time high for 2 months ago. And they might stop there, or they might go up again. The winter and the temperature this winter will decide, I think. In our model, we have left prices to stay high until end of 2024. Of course, I don't know how long prices will stay high, but 2 years is about what it takes for Europe to build new regasification import terminal, so you then can have sufficient amount of LNG coming in, and then you don't have to have these extreme high import prices, but rather get the normal LNG prices, which are higher than the Russian gas, but still lower than what we have today. The acceptability for the high gas and electricity prices are reasonably high, because you could blame an external party and not your own government. So, in addition, the government are partly covering the high costs for households and businesses. So they try to shield the consumers from the worst effects of this. Let me also say one thing on affordability, which is not related to Europe. But when we buy the gas or when EU buy the LNG for record high prices, there are someone else who don't get that LNG. So what happens in Bangladesh and India and in Pakistan? They go back to coal. So that is part of the consequence. So that's one of the reasons why Europe could manage to accelerate the transition while the rest of the world cannot. The third corner, the sustainability corner of the triangle, have had high attention in Europe for many years. And Europe is the leading region for the decarbonization. There are increasing tensions within EU between North and South and between East and West. And let's remember that at the moment it's not one war in Europe, it's two. It's the war on the battlefield, and then it's the energy war between Russia and the rest of Europe. And these increasing tensions are giving us higher risk for hesitating on whether we need to have that tough sanctions against Russian energy, etc., which again is helping to win the other war or to lose the other war. But it is very fortunate that security and sustainability are pulling in the same direction. And with some few exceptions short term, like a little more coal power the first few years, we don't see a big risk for reducing, for increasing coal use in Europe longer term, but rather we see an increased renewable energy build-out, increased efforts for energy efficiency, a little bit on nuclear. Nothing like the French build-out after the oil crisis, and renewables. New nuclear cannot help us anything with the present crisis, but prolonging the present plant and delaying the shutdown, of course, can. And new nuclear will take 10 years or more. I saw they were to build a new one in Poland now. Completion was estimated, and it normally is delayed to 2033. I'll also take a little longer-term look on what do we see, and where Schmidhuber's graphs were 30 years backwards, mine will look 30 years forward. And that's, of course, much more uncertain, and I haven't deflated it or anything like that. But the transition is very different around the world. And if you sit in India or sit in Norway, it's very different. The story of energy transition is first and foremost a story of electrification. And electricity is also the part of the energy system where things are going well and where things are going fast. And we call it the growing and greening of electricity around the world. This picture shows the European electricity mix. And we see that it's already relatively low on fossil fuel. It's only 25-30%. And by mid-century, we expect that to be negligible. But we will have the growing of wind and of solar, and wind is the bigger. In Europe, almost 50% of the power is likely to come from wind, and a lot of that from offshore wind. And it's the continent with largest wind share. Of course, you have then about 70% of the energy is coming from variable energy, where the wind doesn't blow and sun doesn't shine all the time. So that gives us a lot of challenges on the electricity system. But still, so that means that even though it's cheaper and cheaper to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity, it's not necessarily cheaper for the consumer, because you also have to pay for a much more complex grid. Still, it's a success story from a decarbonization perspective. We shouldn't neglect the biodiversity and other challenges in this, but this is doable. There is no other areas where we see an as big change as in the gas forecast we have this year. And in Europe, we actually see 25% lower gas consumption in 2030. And 45% lower gas consumption in 2050 than we did a year ago. So when Europe now is building itself out of the short-term gas crisis because of unavailable or not sufficient gas, then they're also long-term build themselves into a less gas-dependent region. Because when you now build new buildings, you build them with heat pumps instead of gas boilers, for example. So we do see a long-term shift on this. Also globally, there is a much lower, significantly lower gas demand in 2030 and 2050 in our forecast now than we saw a year ago. So although the war is not the most decisive factor for the long-term outlook, for gas demand, it actually is. And then is this good or bad for the environment? It's both, because gas, the reduced share of gas globally is partly replaced by more emitting coal and partly by less emitting renewables. So for the climate, it's maybe a zero-sum game. And what about hydrogen? We had a hydrogen forecast coming out this year, and this is European hydrogen demand. And we see that it's considerable today, and it's used in refineries and for ammonia and fertilizer production. But hydrogen as an energy carrier don't exist almost today. It will come, and it will come in 3 sectors: in heavy industry, the blue one here, in buildings, the green one, and in transport, the gray one. And the latter will typically not be in as pure hydrogen, but as ammonia or e-fuels. And that is probably the only other big consumer we will get for ammonia will be shipping. And shipping has an potential to be a bigger consumer of ammonia than what fertilizer production is today. The green one here is relatively European specific. In the rest of the world, you will see mostly on the blue one and on the gray one here. What does this do with emissions? Europe has a very ambitious strategy of reducing CO2 emissions with 55% from 1990 levels in 2030 and net zero in 2050. We don't find that they manage, but still we find that they reduce it a lot. And our findings is a 48% reduction of emissions to 2030 and an 85% reductions to 2050. So to summarize, the high energy prices and the energy security focus that now dominates after or due to the war in Russia are having a lot of short-term consequences, but long-term it's not the most decisive factor for the transition. In Europe, we are able to accelerate the energy transition as a consequence of the war because it makes us double down on energy efficiency measures and on renewable energy. In the rest of the world, this only worsens the present situation, and the priorities are now the short-term focus. And despite urgency of action from Guterres' Code Red for Humanity and the three IPCC reports coming out the last year, we still see global CO2 emissions remain at present record high levels. We only see a reduction of about 5% this decade and 45% through to 2050, which is very different from the net zero 2050 imperative we need to reach 1.5 degrees. And if we as we look towards the end of the century, most likely, as DNV sees it, we expect the technological, political development will be around 2.2 degrees of global warming. That was all I had to say. You can download reports here from our website. Everything is freely available. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There'll be Q&A now, question and answers. And I'll invite you, Alvik, to join us here. I'll invite Schmidt-Huber up on stage as well, Deputy Director FAO. And I'll also invite Wolfgang Butcher to the stage, back on stage, Director General of the Agricultural and Rural Development of the European Union.
And if we're not at the table, we're on the menu, so it's good that we're here.
Well done. That kicked it off. Thank you to all of you. There's a slight optimism I could feel, Alvik, for Europe at least.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but that doesn't really matter because the climate is, unlike most other problems, it's a global one. So it doesn't help Europe if we reduce our emissions and the rest of the world isn't. So unlike many other crises, this is really a global one. So optimism or pessimism, that depends on where you look from.
Where you're situated.
Yeah.
Exactly. Schmidt-Huber, you work on, please come closer. I don't know if the cameras can, do you want to, okay, yeah. Let's.
Like that?
Musical chairs. Okay. You worked with a new agflation index, has hit the bullseye, linked to challenges with increasing costs due to energy crisis and rising inflation. Is there anything that has surprised you from what you have learned through the process with the new index?
Well, we've always been keenly aware of the fact that agriculture is a very energy-intensive industry, and we tend to forget this. And when prices for energy and everything that's derived from energy go through the roof, then this comes back in a very stark manner. And that's actually the situation in which we are. So there's nothing one can do about this in the short run. So it's just, this is the way the industry is. And unfortunately, most of the energy that's being consumed in agriculture is fossil energy. So going forward, agriculture also has to become greener. And even if Mr. Butcher is beating me up afterwards, there will be no complete or no effective decarbonization of the world without decarbonizing also agriculture. It's just too big an emitter to ignore it.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yes.
You don't have to. I'm just giving you the option.
I think it's a very important issue. As long as we are producing food, we impact on environment, climate, and biodiversity. It's by its very nature. Producing food and having something to eat, you need to do something. On land, which might produce CO2 emissions because you liberate, if you're plowing, you liberate methane or CO2 emissions. If you are having animals to feed the world, it has an impact. So I think what we are discussing here is that we reduce to the extent possible the impact of agriculture on climate, environment, biodiversity. But still, we need to have enough to eat. We all agree. So I think, and that's the challenge of us all. And I think you are very right. You have been discussing about energy, which is a worldwide issue. And the same thing is true for the agriculture. I really feel that the common agricultural policy is quite a green agricultural policy compared to other parts of the world. So again, I think the challenge is that all agriculture across the continents has to contribute, and for the same reason that what do you gain in terms of worldwide reduction of CO2 emissions if you do it in Europe, but not in the rest of the world? The same question you can ask yourself with respect to agriculture.
Yeah, actually, I can only second what Mr. Butcher just said. It's very important. It also comes out when we look into the greenhouse gas emissions that FAO is producing on a quantitative basis. So Europe is faring very well in terms of emission and emission growth. So it's actually an agricultural sector with a low carbon footprint. That, in part, going forward, also has to do with the fact that there's practically no population growth. No, so it's a stable population, and it's then relatively easy if you can bring down per capita emissions to overall bring down the emissions from agriculture.
So Norway will produce the oil most environmental friendly, Australia will produce the coal most environmental friendly, and Europe will produce the meat the most environmental friendly. Is that the logic?
Is that the logic?
Well, this is one of the big development questions. There is no easy question to this, and we are completely aware of the trade-off. So the big proposal has always been shut agriculture down in areas where the carbon intensity is very high. And if one looks at the carbon intensity across agriculture in the world, it's very easy to discern high carbon intensity in, for instance, the ruminant sector of India, simply because there are lots of cows and they're producing methane and they're not producing as much milk as here. So unsurprisingly, their carbon footprint is relatively deep. But do we want to kill the cows in India? No, certainly not. And it goes a long way.
And especially not the Indians.
Exactly. Well, no, okay, oh God, that was completely un-PC what I said, but it was unintentionally. But even if it was not in India, it would be the same argument. And so that's really something that we need to bear in mind. There are conflicting goals, and we need to find a balance between the conflicting goals. But that said, and the whole point I wanted to make, some 20 years back, we were almost not allowed to speak about the carbon footprint of agriculture. And we've come a long way from that. And it's important that we've come a long way because as I said, to decarbonize the world requires to also decarbonize agriculture. That's one of the challenges we have to confront. How we do this needs to be seen. And clearly, this has income issues in Europe. This has existential issues in places like India. And these goals need to be reconciled in one way or the other, but the awareness must be there. You cannot decarbonize the world without decarbonizing agriculture.
Awareness. There are a number of, I know you want to continue on this, but I'll just, there are a number of questions here online again. And to Alvik, in your opinion, can Europe live with a situation where European gas prices, TTF, is 5 to 10 times above the US level? Is that a livable option? Solution.
So what of the gas solution can you live with? You can live with high gas prices in buildings because you need to heat your home. You can live with gas, but you cannot live with high gas prices in industry because that is subject for international competition. So that will lead to a phase out of European industry, gas-consuming industry as we know it today, if that were to maintain on those levels, which we don't think will happen, at least not for more than 2 years. But even that is very bad.
In another question here, will Norway be a key partner as gas provider to Europe in the short term? Question. How may that happen when it is limited by the pipeline availability and also its LNG exports are extremely small versus Europe's need for 400 plus BCM?
Yeah, Norway have managed to increase their export of gas from 110 to 120 billion cubic meter a year this year, and that is the maximum. And neither production nor pipeline capacity can take more. So when Russia used to export 140 and Norway could add up for 10 of those, we can only fill 6-7% of the gap.
Schmidhuber, question for you. In your opinion, will 2023, so next year, be worse than the current year, 2022, when it comes to farmer economy and, in the end, productivity?
One of the things I try to explain is that we should be very vigilant that this is not happening. So at the moment, there's a silver lining on the horizon. The silver lining is actually that energy prices are coming down. They have precipitously falling in Europe with gas prices, as we've seen it. But in the US, we have this almost absurd situation where natural gas prices are turning negative again. That's crazy, no? In Texas last week, it essentially happened. So it looks as though it's more a question of logistics, and eventually I'm not the energy and the gas expert, but I think eventually the market will settle in a lower equilibrium. I also think that there will be demand destruction because the global recessionary forces are much stronger than we thought. And with a global recession in place, it's very hard to imagine that oil and gas prices can remain at these record levels. Unfortunately, that may also hold for food. So when we speak about demand destruction for energy, that's fine with us in a way. When we speak about demand destruction for food, that means hunger.
To Ulrik here, the big question is, of course, what will happen this winter and a number of different issues. What, in your view, can we expect in the next few months? Maybe more importantly, if the conflict with Russia is a long-term conflict, what should Europe do next summer, in your opinion, to prevent a new energy crisis emerging next year and the coming winters?
Yeah, probably the next winter is the most critical one, and how critical it will be this winter is very dependent on the temperature, which is hard to forecast. But I heard some meteorologists say it will not be a very cold one. It's only a few limited things you can do as an energy consumer, and of course turning down heat and turning off air conditioning and all that has worked remarkably well the last 6 months, and that will need to continue at least for another 18 months until you're over the most critical period. But it's all reason to believe that it will be another tough 18 months for European gas consumers.
So let's keep staying strong and hope for not a too cold winter. Finally, Buchner, if I may, after hearing all of this today, what would be your final message to the audience before we wrap up this debate?
I would like firstly to thank both colleagues for these excellent presentations, because I've very carefully listened and I've learned a lot, not being an energy specialist nor an economist. What I've learned in particular is that looking to the tables that Josef has presented, that we are often confronted now with this argument that it is true that the costs for farmers are increasing, but at the same time their gains are also increasing because the market prices are high. And I think his analysis has really shown that at least across the world we have really an issue with farmers' incomes, in fact, which might lead to an issue of from affordability to availability of food. If farmers do not exist anymore because they cannot afford their prices, we have really a big issue.
And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much to Wolfgang Buchner, our man in Brussels, Director General, Agriculture and Rural Development, the European Union, and to our man in Rome, Schmidhauer, Josef Schmidhauer. Thank you so much, Deputy Director, FAO, and to our man in Oslo, yes, Svein Alvik. Thank you so much, DNV GL, Norske Veritas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nei, jeg heter Olav Brattås. Jeg bor rett på utsida av Åsgårdstrand. Jeg har dyrket løk egentlig alltid, vel. Når jeg var liten, så var dette håndarbeid. Nå det nesten 100% maskinelt arbeid. Rødløken mer krevende å produsere. Den litt mer følsom for kjemi, blant annet. Må være litt mer forsiktig med gjødsling. Altså, vi har en norsk andel på løk på ca. 80–85%. Det ganske bra.
Great. Welcome back. Velkommen tilbake. We're moving into the last session of speakers. A quick 3 or 4 people in the run now without any Q&A, so you don't need to worry about sending in all your questions, etc. First off is Christian Anton Smedshaug. He's CEO of Agri Analyse. Christian Anton Smedshaug has since 2011 headed Agri Analyse, former advisor on international questions at the Norwegian Farmers Union, Norges Bondelag, worked at the political level at the Ministry of Environment, and has written a number of books. Smedshaug, the word is yours. The floor is yours.
Takk for det. Jeg tenkte jeg faktisk skulle prøve meg på norsk nå, for nå har vi, tror jeg, en ganske stor norsk andel, og så tror jeg at det faktisk blir bedre. And I'm sorry for our Brazilian friend here that will try Norwegian, but the good thing is that the slides are in English, so I think it will be relatively easy to follow it. Så dette da gjort et arbeid som vi har gjort i Agri-analyse i sommer, også delvis inspirert og i samråd med Yara, knyttet til også å se fremover mot 2050, ikke da på energi, men på mat, og i forhold til det som Veritas og FAO kan stille opp med av liksom bakgrunnsressurser, så vel dette her litt mer utregninger på baksiden av konvolutten, men det gir samtidig litt sånn indikasjoner på hvor vi står hen, og hvor vi på vei, og hva som gapet, både i det vi kan se på produksjonsestimatet, men også på produktivitet. Og det gjort sammen med Vitak og Rakkenes, som hadde en sånn sommerinternship hos oss i den sommeren vi har lagt bak oss. Og for de som vil lese mer, så det oppsummert en del i en nasjonartikkel, så det landbruket mot 2050. Men det som jeg tror vi kan liksom, står midt oppi, det en ganske sånn historisk sett, ikke så uvanlig. Det står allerede om i Bibelen, med 7 magre og 7 fete år. Dette de fete, kan vi si. Det prisene lave, det overskudd. Dette de magre, det prisene høye, det det underskudd. Ikke sant? Fra 0,0 til 0,7, lave priser. 0,8 til 14, høye priser. 14 til 20 lave priser, og nå fra høsten 20 og fremover det igjen høye priser. Og som vi ser, de kommer ikke ned med det første. Schmidhuber har vist at bytteforholdet for bonden ganske dårlig, så egentlig så får han fortsatt for lite for egentlig å ha et gunstig bytteforhold. Og Veritas og Alvik har jo vist at dette sånn at kanskje neste år blir enda tøffere, og 2024 tidligst hvor vi i balanse. Ikke sant? Det betyr at dette stopper ikke med det første, så da vil jo si at Mosebok omtrent lik, at når du først setter i gang, så tar det en stund for å komme ned. Ikke sant? The cure for high prices is high prices, men da må jo dette virke en stund, og vi ikke der ennå. Sånn foreløpig så følger vi Bibelen da etter tusenårsskiftet, og det jo da til tross for at, som Schmidhuber sa, vi har ganske gode lagre. Dette lagernivåene. De jo langt høyere enn da vi var i forrige periode. Det var sånn 600 millioner tonn, nå det 850 millioner tonn. Men likevel det ganske røffe tilstander i markedene. Og det ikke sånn at produksjonen veldig mye lavere enn forbruket. Det sånn pluss minus omtrent likt. Så ser vi her hvor forbruket var noe høyere enn produksjonen sist gang. Det var på lavere lag nå. Det var ikke noe spesiell prisrespons her. Men det åpenbart at det skjer noe særlig i markedet nå, og det nok fordi at hele kostnadssiden drar opp det prisnivået vi ser, pluss at stressnivået gjennom endringer da av verdikjedene, koronautfordringer, og i tillegg det grønne skiftet da, med høyere energipriser, alt dette drar samtidig, så dette jo ikke en vanlig syklus som vi hadde forrige gang, hvor poenget var å få Kina inn i forsyningssystemet i verden. Nå jo delvis poenget å få Kina ut av deler av forsyningssystemet når det gjelder liksom industrivarer, og så det for Russland ut av råvaresystemet, og så det for oljen ut av energisystemet. Og det ganske mye på en gang, i tillegg til en råvaresyklus. Og det klart at dette gjør at dette blir krevende, og det blir i hvert fall, det tar noen år, og ingen egentlig vet hvor lang tid det vil ta. Og i dette bildet her så har det det har vært en måling da, globalt å se på hvordan vurderer man den regionale matsikkerheten. Den ganske høy i USA, ikke spesielt overraskende. Ganske brukbar i Europa. Kina også. Det en stor importør. Skal i hvert fall på papiret ha store lagre. Litt vanskelig å få det helt verifisert, men det i hvert fall mye mat. De har fungerende handel- og importsystem. Latinamerika selvfølgelig, stor tilgang, men det klart der det kjøpekraftsutfordringer. Sør-Asia har utfordringer, mens Øst-Asia fungerer rimelig bra. Og så det Afrika peker seg veldig tydelig ut, så vi tenkte å ha litt ekstra fokus der. Fordi der jo også folketallsveksten høyest, og der underskuddene store i dag. Og Schmidhuber var også inne på kostnadene ved import. Så vi bare tok en liten sånn, siden jeg på baksiden av konvolutten her, vi ser at vi økte befolkningen da fra 2000 til 2021 med ca. 28%, og så økte vi kornproduksjonen med ca. 50%. Så det jo ikke sånn at det har vært vanskelig å øke kornproduksjonen i takt med økt etterspørsel og folketall. Det har jo gått relativt bra. Hvis vi da ser for 2050, da, så vi regner med at vi 9,6 millioner mennesker, så ser man for at det ca. 22% vekst. Men hvis vi da ser for oss at vi vokser ikke med 2% i året, som vi har gjort med matproduksjonen da i denne perioden her, men vi vokser med 1,4, og da har tatt vekk en tredjedel da, på klimautfordringer og så videre. Så skal vi likevel kunne greie å øke med bortimot 50%, da, for da har vi jo 29 år, og her hadde vi 21 år, ikke sant? Sånn sett så ser jo ikke dette her umulig ut, og det kan godt være at det også går, men det klart, legger man på alle de begrensningene, da, sånn som Butcher og EU-kommisjonen står for, og som Borgstrøm da nevnte at kunne gi 10-20% reduksjon i produsert volum, og kanskje 20-40% økte kostnader, så situasjonen kanskje litt annerledes med dette her, for her det primært klima som lagt inn, her det ikke lagt inn politiske endringer, altså det vi har sett i Holland og så videre, så det masse ting som kan gjøres for å forbedre denne, men bare sånn for å ta det liksom i utgangspunktet, altså det gikk mye bedre enn man fryktet da, sist gang. Og det ikke sånn at selv med å ta ned vekstnivået, så ser det ikke sånn kjempegalt ut mot 2050. Men dette vet vi ikke, men det vi vet at utfordringen, hvis vi forutsetter at dette så noenlunde riktig, så utfordringen ganske stor i Afrika, som nevnt hvor det var usikkert. Og hvis vi bare ser på Afrika sør for Sahara, jeg prøvde bare å sette opp en kjapp oversikt, så ser man at der har økningsraten i produksjon ikke vært all verden på kornproduksjonen. Så det mye annet som vokser der. De produserer jo kassava, og det stivelsesrike knoller av ulike slag og så videre, så de spiser jo mer enn korn, men korn lettest å analysere. Men importen øker langt raskere da enn egenproduksjonen. Eksporten jo nesten ikke noe av, så det det jo ikke mangel på eksport som holder med igjen, det jo mangel på produksjon. Forbruket da, dette av korn da igjen, stiger med 2,7%, så det tas jo da misforholdet mellom det de produserer og det de konsumerer, tas jo da gjennom økt import. Og folketallet vokser betydelig, rundt 3,7%. Så at dette misforholdet her jo da økende, og det her den virkelig videre folketallsveksten ser ut til å komme i årene fram mot 2050. Så hvis vi sier da, så vi framskriver da den veksten som vi har hatt de første 20 årene fram til 2050, så vil de produsere 326 millioner tonn, men de vil importere da omtrent like mye. Og så sier vi det, og eksporten da, den blir ytterligere redusert, så den blir jo i praksis null da, men det var en framskrivning. Og så sier vi at de spiser jo ikke tilstrekkelig i dag, så vi må legge inn litt ekstra anslått, ikke sant, for at de skal komme opp på et noenlunde konsumsjonsnivå, og så en forbedret kost, det vil si at de spiser noe mer, og at sannsynligvis noe blir foredlet gjennom husdyr på ulike vis, som øker forbruket av korn. Og det betyr at vi på fort 862, så vi bare beregnet, millioner tonn, og så produserer de selv 326. Det misforholdet her betydelig da. Så en bok som heter African Food Crisis, som kom rundt 2005, den fortsatt relevant, dessverre. Og hvis vi ser på FAOs oppdatering nå, og hvor de landene som nå sitter med mer eller mindre akutte matutfordringer, så det jo konsentrert her, og så det enkeltland av ulike årsaker. Venezuela henger vel ikke akkurat sammen med fruktbarheten, det vel helt andre ting. Så det Ukraina selvfølgelig, og så det noen få land ellers, men her den konsentrerte utfordringen, ikke sant? Og den relativt massiv. Og så, hvordan løser man det? Det selvfølgelig ikke enkelt, men det kommer ned til produktivitet da. Og V.S. Lewis fikk Nobelprisen i økonomi på 60-tallet, og hans budskap jo klart, at når det mange bønder, eller som Tvinnerem sa, når det mange som tilsynelatende matprodusenter, men likevel sultne, så betyr det jo det at de ikke matprodusenter fordi de produserer effektivt, de matprodusenter fordi de har ikke noe annet å drive med, så de produserer suboptimalt, og de produserer for lite. Da må produktiviteten opp, og det gjelder jo både for jorda, men også selvfølgelig for arbeidsproduktiviteten. Og i forrige matkrise så anslo jo Verdensbanken at det var 3-4 ganger mer effektivt å redusere fattigdom gjennom vekst i landbruket enn i andre deler av økonomien. Så det relativt klart at produktiviteten liksom noe av nøkkelen. Så hvis vi ser det her fra Overworlded Data, har en ganske gode tydeliggjøring av dette her, at her ser vi at vi ikke i en malthussituasjon, ikke sant? Produksjonen av korn har økt langt raskere enn befolkningen, hvis vi ser prosentvis vekst, og det primært gjennom produktivitetsvekst, altså avlingsnivået øker løpende, og så litt grann på areal, men primært gjennom avlingsvekst, eller produktivitetsvekst. Men her legger Afrika voldsomt, hvor du ser her at utviklingen i avlingsnivået i Afrika fra 60 dager bare en dobling, mens for eksempel i Asia har gått 2,5 gang. Det betyr at Asia nesten ikke har økt arealet, mens i Afrika har det økt mer enn dobbelt, langt mer enn avlingsnivået, så det betyr at man har egentlig primært økt avlingene gjennom å øke areal, og ikke gjennom at man øker avlingsnivå. Og dette det productivity gap som hvis ikke vi får løst det, så det veldig vanskelig å se hvordan man skal kunne greie å fø Afrika, hvordan dette skal kunne greie å komme i balanse, og hvordan vi skal greie å stabilisere situasjonen. Prognosene jo ikke all verden. Jeg ser at Afrikas andel av verdens populasjon rundt 17% i 2018. 2040 ligger det an til 23, mens andelen av BNP stiger ikke tilsvarende. Ikke sant? Så her vi i en voldsomt etterslep, og havner lenger og lenger bak. Og hvis man greier selvfølgelig å øke produktiviteten, så sparer jo også mye areal, ikke sant? Så det jo vinn-vinn. En ting jo for den forsyningssikkerheten som sådan, og for å sikre at verdikjeden og forsyningskjeden virker. Men det jo også fordi at dette jo vinn-vinn for natur, biomangfold og så videre, at man kan drive noenlunde bærekraftig og spare areal men samtidig drive effektivt der man driver. Og det er jo dette som på en måte det generelle i verden, men så i Afrika så jo arealøkningen, den jo da større enn avlingsøkningen. Og historisk sett så har jo arealøkning vært den viktigste arealøkning eller økning av inputfaktor vært den viktigste årsaken til økt. Det skulle ikke stått productivity her, men det skulle stått production. Så ser vi at den generelle produksjonsøkningen har vært nesten 3% fra 60 til 70, ved at man hever inn mer, ikke sant? Gjerne mer gjødsel, mer sprøytemidler, som hovedelementer, og så hadde man økning av areal. Men så øker jo det grønne utover, og så ser jeg at man da greier å få mer ut av det man driver med gjennom presisjonslandbruk, altså mer presis tilførsel, bedre frø, bedre agronomi, bedre maskiner, altså alle disse tingene som gjør at man får mer ut av samme ressursmengde. Og det ser jo da ganske lovende ut, selv om at totalproduksjonen faller noe per år. Her vi tilbake til omtrent de 2% da, som vi så i stad. Men hvis vi ser dette her i forhold til de ulike kategoriene av land, så ser vi at lavinntektsland, de øker primært gjennom at de øker areal, mens høyinntektsland, de tar ut areal, ikke sant? Og samtidig greier å øke produksjonen. Ikke sant? Man totalfrakteproduktiviteten øker, du får mer ut av her da ørligere fallende areal, og pluss minus det samme inputfaktorene. Så sånn sett har dette vært ganske vellykket. Hvis man ser dette opp imot da de nye begrensningene da, som Butcher pratet om, til tross for at man egentlig har lykkes ganske godt, så kan det sies å være litt paradoksalt når man egentlig så på rett vei, og man står jo foran en fortsatt utvikling av det man kan kalle presisjonslandbruk, ikke sant? Hvor man fortsatt vil kunne forbedre arealutnyttelsen betydelig. Så jeg ikke går i alle detaljer på den figuren, men det liksom det som noe av hovedpoenget her. Samtidig som produktivitetsskapet da illustreres jo veldig tydelig i lavinntektslandet. Og noe av det jo da knyttet til selvfølgelig tilførsel av mineralgjødsel. Nå ser ni jo forskjellen på NPK da, mellom Norge, verden og for eksempel Afrika, og det jo her den store utfordringen ligger, og den må løses på globalt nivå da. Så ser det ut, og hvordan får man det til? Ikke sant? Det jo ikke fort gjort, men det var relativt vellykket i den grønne revolusjonen i Asia. Dette hentet fra en bok som vises i stad, African Food Crisis, hvor den internasjonale geopolitiske situasjonen og nasjonale situasjonen og teknologien, sammen med en skal vi si, fornuftig statlig styring, fokuserte på small-scale familielandbruk og brukte markedet smart og ga nasjonal selvforsyning i korn, primært ris og hvete da, i Asia. Så en del av denne modellen må brukes parallelt med at man må få sette bonden i sentrum, altså bondens insentiv jo det avgjørende her. Altså at eierskap til areal, at prisene blir riktige, så du får produksjonsinsentivet, at du får dekket kostnadene, at investeringene dine gjør deg rikere, og du produserer mer, at ikke de bare fører til at du får høyere gjeld, og du ikke får igjen for investeringene. At det må skapes et sikkerhetsnett rundt bonden, der priser og eierskap eller lange kontrakter ganske avgjørende. Og det den debatten vi egentlig står i nå, og som ganske tydelig, for eksempel en bok her da, fra en afrikansk tenketank, som jo legger veldig vekt på disse forholdene, hvor produktivitetsskapet noe av det som virkelig holder Afrika igjen. Og det klart, når de som bønder mer av nød enn av lyst, og de ikke engang produserer nok til sitt eget forbruk, så det klart at dette et overlevelsesaktivitet og ikke en økonomisk aktivitet som skaper dynamikk i økonomien eller greier å svare ut det produksjonsbehovet som regionen har. Og som sagt, det jo flere som mener at disse utsiktene relativt dystre. Så hvordan ligger vi da an? På kort sikt så må vi jo øke finansieringen til verdens matvareprogram. Og som Smith-Huber nevnte, den Food Importing Financing Facility, som da skal gi mulighet for å importere til de landene som i dag sliter rett og slett med finansieringen direkte. Det et veldig godt avgjørende grep, og særlig når vi vet at det egentlig ikke mengden mat det står på primært, men det primært at kostnadene drar seg nå så langt gjennom kjeden at de landene ikke egentlig har råd til å importere det volumet som de trenger, som tilgjengelig. Vi tilbake til at dette ikke primært på globalt nivå et produksjonsspørsmål sånn som det akkurat nå, så 2023 et annet game, men nå tar vi utgangspunkt sånn som det akkurat nå, så det ganske rasjonelt. Så tror jeg at man skulle gå fra IFAD, som da finansierer landbruksutvikling i dag, til å lage en Agriculture Development Bank i et mye større omfang, for at det vil bli helt avgjørende at man får til det både for det etterslepet som og ikke minst på grunn av klimaendringer og andre utfordringer. Og et regionalt lagersystem, og det ikke uten grunn, altså vi siterte jo de bibelske syklusene i sted, men man kan jo også sitere da noe av løsningen. Jo, det var jo sikkert et lagersystem som skapte en buffer, og lagersystem vil jo også kunne holde prisene ned internasjonalt for å unngå de store svingningene og ta toppene. Og selvfølgelig dreier det seg om mineralgjødsel, og det dreier seg også om noe som litt undervurdert. Det dreier seg om kalking, få opp pH, øke fertiliteten i jorda, ikke minst i Afrika, eller mange deler av Afrika, som har den rødaktige jorden, den vanskelige jorda, som litt tilsvarende som i Brasil, og som Mato Grosso et eksempel på. Man kalket opp ganske mye før man greide å få tilpasset frø og få den produktiviteten som var nødvendig. Og så det selvfølgelig en del akutt som kan gjøres innenfor de nasjonale situasjonene. Og selvfølgelig Good Agriculture Policy, det blir jo et annet foredrag, men det klart der ligger også en del kontroversialitet i forhold til tollvern, i forhold til politisk handlefrihet, og få opp det rammeverket som gjør at bonden har insentiv, bonden får en lønnsomhet som gjør investeringene mulig. Og gitt at vi får til det, så jo håpet da at vi kommer oss gjennom disse problemene med å forstå landbruket best mulig, motivere bonden best mulig internasjonal politikk, så håndterer vi dette her. Det jo ikke unike ting, men det en litt unik setup, så nå setter ting litt på spissen. Takk.
Tack ska du ha, Christian Anton. Thank you so much, Smedsert, for that. Thank you also for suggesting to us a number of readings to follow up on, so we'll be able to read more and follow up on that. Next one up joins us all the way from Brazil. Gabriela Fontanari, our very own, from Yara, market intelligence specialist here at Yara, who's flown in from Brazil. And I understand it's your first time in Norway. It's your first time in Europe. Thank you. Floor is yours. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for the kind introduction and all the warm welcome that I have been receiving in the last couple of days. Well, before I start my presentation, I think it's just good. I think it's going to be very interesting because we are going to put into dialogue and also it goes well against all that we have been hearing today regarding the global challenges, what Africa faces. Brazil is such an important part when we look at the agricultural sector, not only in production, but also when we look at the fertilizer sector as the fourth largest consumer in the world. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what has been done in Brazil so far, how we got where we are today, and some challenges and opportunities that I think will go quite well along with what we've heard along the day. So with no further ado, Brazil has been increasing steadily its international presence in the commodities market, the food production international market in the last decade, if I dare say so. From 2013 onwards, we have been, as a country, the main exporters for soybeans, but we also rank quite high when we look at the production of orange juice, coffee, sugar, corn, and most important for some countries, animal protein as well. And alongside the production, we also are a major exporter and increasingly a rank, especially after the pandemic, as one of the main exporters for the international system. In that case, I know that some partners have been mentioned, whereas when we look at the trade flow internationally, and I think it's very important to highlight, when I mentioned that Brazil has a very significant role in international production and exports for soybeans, as an example, in 21, we produced over 90 million metric tons of soybeans, and the exports actually were around 85 to 90 million tons, and 70% of that went to China. When we look at the soy oil, we also see an interesting flow to Asia, and the soy meals, we see also Asia, but we also start to look more at Europe as an example. And why is that important? Why did I bring these numbers specifically? I brought also the trade flow for Brazil when we look at fertilizer imports, specifically the nitrogen market. We can see that Russia, China, and also Northern Africa and Middle Eastern countries are very important exporters of fertilizers in Brazil. And when we look at the challenges that Brazil faces, when we put specifically it into logistics, this will have a significant impact because grains and fertilizers, they use basically the same vessels and also the same trucks that use the roads. It's basically they go out with grains and they come in with fertilizers. So this is also very important for the challenges that Brazil face as one of the countries that is so important for international trade, but also has its internal challenges when we look at its vast extension. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It has been mentioned also when we start zooming in at the production specifically for soybeans. I brought this just to show the importance that GMO and non-GMO, the relation between both, they have been steading up in the last couple of years. And this will make a lot of sense because this was one of the main developments for the production, especially in the land use in Brazil. So we have seen an extension of agriculture, especially from Mato Grosso. I don't have the laser point right now, but basically the yellow is pasture and mosaic agriculture and pasture is yellowy, and it's extending for areas what they called the Cerrado or savanna in Brazil. And that was mainly due to research and improvements in productivity yields, especially due to seeds, and also fertilizers that possibilitate the production in these areas. And also looking into the shifts that have been happening within Brazil, the land use for agriculture above the 16-degree parallel, which I show here in the map, it's cut by the 16 here. In previously also here in the land use, when we look at the further northern states, it also shifted the production, where the main areas where production for these grains have been happening. So there was a steady increase of production above the 16th parallel, and that also led to a change in logistics and challenges that Brazil faces today. Looking at traditional for the exports, when we talk about grains, remembering that I mentioned that grains go to the ports and with the same trucks, the same railroads, they bring back the fertilizers. So it's the same logistics for fertilizers, just on the opposite flow. The traditional route from Sorriso, Mato Grosso, which is in red, right up above, and Santos, the port right down here on the left side corner, is around 27 to 30 hours by truck in roads that not necessarily are pavimented. There are maybe in some routes they have there's still terrain. It suffers a lot of flooding. It has a lot of space to grow in terms of infrastructure for logistics in Brazil. And with the shift in production above the 16th parallel, there has been a shift also in these exports and opportunities for logistics, as we see when we talk about the Northern Arc. I don't know if many of you have heard of this region, but it's a logistical shift that has been happening in Brazil, which basically consists in exporting grains and also bringing fertilizers through the northern ports, where sometimes are closer to importing regions, such as Europe, as an example. So it is significantly more advantageous for some producers. If we still talk about sorriso as a base of comparison, it is way closer. It gains 5 hours, an example, and in terms of cost, which are also a challenge this year, especially with the international scenario that has been increasing steadily in fuels, it provides some advantages and opportunities for the sector to look at these alternative routes. So talking specifically about Sorriso, Santarém, which is also signaled up ahead. So in that sense, when we talk about the shift in production and exports, we also see these numbers impacting also the fertilizer sector. We went from 5.6 million to 8.1 million in just a couple of years. So these also, these exports have also presented themselves with opportunities for the fertilizers sectors to also improve and try to mitigate some logistic challenges that still are under a lot of discussion in Brazil. Basically because Brazil is increasing steadily year on year its production and exports. For the last 5 years, an example, planted area has increased 2.5 to 5% per year in terms just of grains, and necessarily in exponentially its production, but it wouldn't be possible without the further consumption of fertilizers, which increased significantly. When we look at the consumption by crop, soybeans represent almost 50% of fertilizers consumption in Brazil, and also that shift has also happened with the safrinha or winter corn crop, because Brazil is basically one of the countries that is able to do 2 harvests, one after another, based on these developments that we mentioned in research for seeds and also fertilizer applications due to monitoring rains, and also research that has been decreasing the time that the soybean and the corn they need to mature to be exported. So Brazil has been increasing its presence internationally due to this competitive and this research that has been happening in the agriculture area. So that is why also soybean and corn, they represent over 60%, almost 70% in some years of the consumption for fertilizers. Which also leads to another domestic challenge. I've been talking a lot about logistics, and mainly when we look at the challenges, logistics is key, because as of 2021, Brazil imported most of its fertilizer consumption, 98% dependent on imports for potash, 94% dependent on nitrogen as a whole, and also around 80% dependent for phosphates in 21. So it's the fourth largest consumer in the world, but it's also heavily dependent on imports. On the contrary of what we look when we look at China, United States, and India, where they also have some national capacity that can surplus and supply more than 10% as an example. And also, as I mentioned, when I talked about the flows, we are heavily also dependent on fertilizer importers to some countries that we export a lot of grains to. So it's also, it puts into perspective that the international geopolitics doesn't impact mostly directly Brazil, but definitely indirectly it does. So what has been happening in Europe in the last year has also impacted and further put some weight into the challenges that Brazil already was facing. So just to give perspective what I was mentioning, from 2011, I would say, we have increased, since 27, we have increased almost in 50%, almost more than 50% of our fertilizer consumption. Considering the last 5 years, we have more than 10 million metric tons more in consumption. So it also makes it necessary that Brazil has a certain agility to react to and adapt to these geopolitical shifts that has been happening, as we know. And also, it's very important to note that Brazil has a different profile in consumption for fertilizers when we look at the other countries that I have mentioned. Comparing to China, India, and the United States, which are heavily consuming N, due to agronomical standards and also the soil composition in Brazil, also the importance that soybean has in our domestic grain production. Brazil is heavily consuming P and K, so it puts Brazil into a spotlight also when we are talking about the P and K market and the challenges going forward. With that, some challenges and opportunities I have mentioned, mostly when we talk about the fertilizers market. High dependency on fertilizer imports is definitely a point going forward. And it definitely puts Brazil in the spotlight when we talk about the fertilizers market future from 23 onwards, and all the logistical and geopolitics that we are going to face going forward. International energy costs that in Brazil, when we talk about the whole supply chain, mostly has been impacting severely costs for roads and also maritime freights as an example. Also, investments in ports and roads in Brazil infrastructure to receive and be able to adapt to this ever-changing market. As I mentioned, in less than 5 years, consumption of fertilizers has more than increased 10 million tons. And we know that investments in ports and infrastructure is a long-term situation. So these are still points that are going to be in the highlight going forward. We also had a port waiting time challenge where our port capacity is still stagnant, as I have mentioned, whereas exports and imports have heavily increased during the pandemic. So this is definitely a challenge going forward. And Brazil is also an important food producer. So basically, all that has happened during the supply chain, not necessarily, it also involves challenges for Brazil as a food exporter, but also as an importer. So Brazil has these challenges right now to see necessarily what lies ahead, and it's really connected to what we have been discussing with Africa, what we have been discussing about Europe as well, because it's all very connected, remembering that Brazil not only is very intensive in agriculture, but is very intensive in feedstock and meat production to feed the world. So this is also a challenge that needs to be met. It has been mentioned here before, worldwide. So bringing these challenges that are much the same that Africa has in the long term and that Europe has also, because everything is basically connected and impacting, even if indirectly, the whole food chain system. And that was what I was going to bring to you today. Thank you very much for the invite and participation.
Thank you so much, Gabriela Fontanari from Brazil, putting Brazil in the spotlight, as we could see, and giving us that practical example on logistical challenges and also how the world is connected, as you so clearly showed us. Thank you so much once again, Gabriela. Next one up, and that's the final of the external presenters. That is Nils Vagstad, Director General at NIBIO, Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research. Long experience from a number of research institutions, both research and management, strategic and operative research management as well. Born in Fjaler, Sogn og Fjordane, educated from NMBU, Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Vagstad will also be presenting both in English and Norwegian. It's all yours.
Yeah. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. I have to admit that I prepared my short summary in advance. So I'll do that in Norwegian, but before I do that, it came to my mind a couple of points. First, I would like to quote my very good old friend from India, the father of the Green Revolution in India, Professor Swaminathan, who is now almost 97 years old, saying that if agriculture goes wrong, nothing else will go right. The second point I would like to raise is about transition risks, transition costs. Transition risks in cases of rapid system changes are, in my opinion, too much undercommunicated, too much underestimated, and deserve much more attention. Systemic shifts could easily become catastrophic shifts if we do not pay sufficient attention to those who will be exposed to the shifts, namely the ordinary people. Social and economic divide over society could easily generate social uprise and political disturbance with far-reaching consequences. And I think this is extremely important to bear in mind when we're discussing whatever change to be, whether it's the so-called green shift or it's the completely change of agricultural systems as such. Okay, then I will switch to Norwegian. Mitt utgangspunkt, når jeg skal forsøke å trekke sammen litt tråder her, det er at matsikkerhet er selve fundamentet for samfunnssikkerheten, for et stabilt samfunn. Hvis matsikkerhet erstattes med matusikkerhet, vil også folkets tillit til myndighetene kunne komme i spill. Men i vår overflodssamfunn har vi for vane å ta det meste for gitt. Også det som går på matsikkerhet. En slags overflodsdekadense, om man vil, som kan bli farlig, rett og slett, fordi få egentlig klar over hvor sårbare hele systemet egentlig er. Slik jeg ser det, så har vi i Norge, takket være den norske landbrukspolitikken i hovedsak, og den norske modellen, blant annet med en sterk og i utgangspunktet solidarisk samvirkebasert landbrukssektor, hatt en relativt sett forutsigbar og stabil situasjon innen matområdet. Etter mitt syn til gunst både for landbruket selv, for den norske forbruker og samfunnet i sin helhet. Men nå er altså mye spill, og antagelig enda mer til i årene fremover. Så en trenger ikke være spesielt stor spåmann for å kunne slå fast at vi går i fremtiden i møte som er særdeles uforutsigbar. Og hva som er den største trusselen, om det er den stadig mer ustabile geopolitiske situasjonen eller dramatiske klimaendringer, eller andre ting som vi ikke har tenkt på ennå, det kommer mest an på tidsperspektivet. Men den stabiliteten vi er vant med, kan høre historier til. Så ustabilitet, uforutsigbarhet, er i seg selv utfordrende, forsiktig sagt. Det kan trigge irrasjonelle handlinger, både politisk og i markedene. Og det kan være en stor hemsko for langsiktige og investeringer i en sektor som står overfor betydelige utfordringer i Norge som ellers i verden. Og det er viktig å understreke at når vi snakker om matsikkerhet, så dreier det seg om mer, selvsagt, enn selve primærproduksjonen. Selv om den er grunnleggende for alt. Det dreier seg om mat- og forsyningssikkerhet som blir mer og mer viktig. Det er mange omliggende faktorer og rammevilkår, indirekte faktorer om jeg vil, og som kanskje en ikke tenker på, kan være helt avgjørende i kritiske situasjoner. Som for eksempel noe så banalt som tilgang til emballasje. Databrikke melkeroboten, for eksempel. For ikke å snakke om destabiliserte energimarkeder. Og da vil jeg peke på et par forhold i forlengelsen av det vi har snakket om her i dag. Det første er risikoforståelse. Norge er eksponert for både globale og nasjonale hendelser og situasjoner som direkte eller indirekte kan påvirke vår matsikkerhet. Det kan dels dreie seg om grunnleggende sårbarhet i den globale økonomien, som er en høyteknologisk logistikkoperasjon med sterk og økende konsentrasjon av produksjon og eierskap, basert på en kontinuerlig fri strøm av varer og tjenester, med små lagre og noen kritiske noder i det globale transportsystemet. Et skip på tverk i Suezkanalen var egentlig en god illustrasjon på det. Geopolitiske konfliktforhold, der Ukraina, Russland, USA i dag er høyaktuelt, men der den store utfordringen blir konsekvensen, ikke dersom, men når konflikten mellom USA og Kina eskalerer videre. Så realiteten er egentlig at hele verdensordenen er i spill. Så oppå dette kommer effektene av klimaendringene og den globale ressurssituasjonen. Spesielt knyttet til areal og vann, men også det som vi snakker alt for lite om, og det er kontrollen av de avgjørende jordmineraler, rare earth minerals. Det er sjeldne mineraler, men absolutt helt kritiske for den moderne samfunnsstrukturen og for det grønne skiftet som vi snakker om. Et skifte som da kanskje ikke er fullt så grønt likevel, muligens. Her står vi overfor en situasjon som jeg vel vil kalle geologiens geopolitikk, som har potensial for å rokke ved hele den politiske og økonomiske verdensordenen, og har i seg et gedigent politisk konfliktpotensial. Det er bare til å se på hvilke land som kontrollerer det såkalte sjeldne mineraler. Og så har vi hørt om klimaendringer, vi har hørt om Afrika, som ser ut til å ramme hardest befolkningstette områder, og der behovet for produksjonsøkning er størst. Det er i seg selv en risikofaktor med stort destabiliseringspotensial. Derfor, tenker jeg, så er det hjelp til selvhjelp for Europa, for vår politiske stabilitet, å investere for å gjøre landet i Afrika i stand til å brødfø egen befolkning. Brødfø egen befolkning, ikke avhengig av hjelp fra vår side. Mens Europa, og etter hvert Kina også, har en raskt økende andel aldrende befolkning, er det helt motsatt i Afrika. Det er mer enn 40% av befolkningen er under 15 år. I dette ligger det et betydelig sprengkraft, egentlig av uvente dimensjoner. Klimaendringene understreker vårt nasjonale ansvar for å ivareta egen produksjon og vårt eget produksjonsgrunnlag. Derfor bør klimatilpasning prioriteres minst like høyt som tiltak for utslippsreduksjoner. Og alle klimatiltak må derfor ses både i et kort og et langsiktig perspektiv, gitt matproduksjonens langsiktige karakter. Så hele verden, inkludert Norge, står altså overfor en svært uforutsigbar framtid, der all logikk tilsier at vi må ta på høyeste alvor vår egen matsikkerhet, og i den sammenheng vår nasjonale beredskap. Og i landbruket er det som kjent de lange tidslinjene som gjelder. Har du først avviklet produksjon, tar det lang tid å etablere ny produksjon. Og kan jo bare minne om for eksempel at det tar 3 år cirka, fra påsett til å få fram en ny melkende ku. Det er greit å ha med seg. Og dette bringer meg inn på et par andre punkter, og det er grunnleggende kunnskap om matproduksjon og hvem som setter agendaen i samfunnsdebatten. Dessverre kan jeg si at færre og færre egentlig vet hva som kreves for å produsere mat, og hva som er mulig, og hva som skal til. Det griper også inn i diskusjonen om mange viktige ting, om diett, ernæringsmessige spørsmål og miljøspørsmål. Og dette gjør at ute i samfunnet kan versere oppfatninger om de skulle få uforholdsmessig stor politisk innflytelse, kan ha uoversiktlige konsekvenser for vår langsiktige matsikkerhet. Det dreier seg om både agronomiske problemstillinger, husdyrfaglige problemstillinger og miljøfaglige problemstillinger. Og la meg bare slå fast, matsystemer som ikke gir matsikkerhet, er heller ikke bærekraftige. Helt tatt begrepet bærekraft blir jo meningsløst og frikoblet fra primærformålet til mat, nemlig matsikkerhet. Og jeg tror det på tide at samtalen om bærekraft i matproduksjon og matsystemer blir noe mer helhetlig. Bærekraft mer enn lave utslipp av klimagasser. I hele tatt så tror jeg den sosiale dimensjonen trenger å bli løftet atskillig mer opp. Så til spørsmålet om hvem som setter agendaen. Og det viktig. For mat, miljø, ernæring, det har blitt mer og mer en polarisert arena. Også i Norge. Og kanskje med undertoner av ideologi. Mange mener mye, og de mener sterkt. Og det klart at det som legger seg av oppfatninger i samfunnet innen disse områdene, blant unge og framtidige beslutningstakere, kan ha store konsekvenser, og for vår matsikkerhet, gitt vårt ressursgrunnlag i Norge. Realiteten at i dag blir mange premisser for våre matvalg, og dermed til sjuende og sist også strukturen i norsk landbruk, i betydelig grad påvirket av det jeg vil kalle aksjonspreget initiativ, drevet fram av sterke lobbygrupper, av influensere med sterke oppfatninger, og som kan kunsten med å håndtere sosiale medier. Jeg tenker det litt sånn greit å ha et litt apropos på det. Gradvis blir etablert det jeg vil kalle vedtatte nye sannheter, med potensielt vidtrekkende konsekvenser for vår matsikkerhet. Det kan være knyttet til miljø, det kan være knyttet til bærekraft, og det kan være knyttet til konkret hva vi spiser. For eksempel rødt kjøtt. Forestillingen om at vi kan klare oss uten mineralgjødsel, for eksempel. Et annet eksempel. Der, til dømes Sri Lanka, fikk seg en dyrekjøpt erfaring, da presidenten ville gjøre alt landbruk om til såkalt økologisk landbruk. Og det vel noe av det nærmeste en kan komme, et skrekkeksempel på hva som kan skje når drastiske endringer blir gjort fort, og uten kunnskap, men tvert imot som symbolhandlinger med uklare formål. De enkle løsningene, ensaksfokuset, som tidvis slår sterkt inn i samfunnsdebatten, kan i seg selv være en vesentlig trussel mot bærekraft, og dermed også for nasjonal matsikkerhet. Diskusjonen rundt norsk landbruk og norsk matproduksjon må derfor også ha en bred og langsiktig tidshorisont og bygge på en dypere risikoforståelse og en tydeligere mulighetsorientering. Verdien av stabilitet og forutsigbarhet for det som skal produsere og for samfunnet i sin alminnelighet må justeres opp. Jeg ser jeg har brukt over tida, men jeg tar 1 minutt til hvis det går. Som jeg ser det, så har landbruket en samfunnskontrakt på samme måten som det norske forsvaret og helsevesenet. Denne samfunnskontrakten heter matsikkerhet, og i den sammenheng risiko- og beredskapsforståelse helt avgjørende. Rettet mot akutte hendelser, men også den langsiktige tryggheten som gir forutsigbarhet. Og kanskje skulle denne samfunnskontrakten vært enda mer tydeligere gjort. Og den viktigste beredskapen som for forsvaret og helsevesenet. Det nemlig den stående beredskapen. Den stående beredskapen i form av høy, stabil nasjonal produksjon, det dessuten en vinn-vinn-situasjon i fredstid. Fordi den i tillegg til beredskapen gir oss vårt daglige brød, dag ut og dag inn og år ut. Den gir oss levende bygder, flotte kulturlandskap, der fastboende og turister og andre kan trives. Og så det, bare for å ta avslutningsvis, i Norge så det sånn at sammen med kornproduksjon, så det drøvtyggerne våre, det vil si kua og sauen, som kan utnytte vekster og uegner til menneskemat, som den virkelige ryggraden i vår nasjonale matsikkerhet. Ja, kua og sauen bokstavelig talt en vandrende beredskapslager, der det går og beiter. Fundamentet i den stående beredskapen derfor et levende og levedyktig landbruk i hele landet, og det bønder med framtidstro, som tar på seg det viktige ansvaret med å produsere maten vår. Når nye generasjoner skal velge å bli bønder, så må det være en tro på at bondeyrket gir et godt liv og meningsfullt liv. Og det forutsigbarhet en del av det som i spill i dag, da, men forutsigbarhet til politikk og andre rammebetingelser kanskje den mest avgjørende. Så med det så tenker jeg runde av der. Det var jo i hvert fall en del knytninger tilbake til det som har vært sagt i dag, men også en del viktige poeng. Og helt avslutningsvis vil jeg si, når vi diskuterer bærekraft, så tror jeg det utrolig viktig å løfte enda sterkere fram den sosiale komponenten av bærekraftsbegrepet. Takk.
Tusen takk skal du ha, Nils Vakstad. Thank you so much. That was a lot of food for thought, trying to sum up today's speakers and topics and discussions we've had. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We have had rich discussions, and there'll be ample opportunity to continue the discussions out in the canteen afterwards, or any other platform that you prefer to continue your conversations in. We invite you all now to the Yara canteen, just across the reception here. Some snacks and drinks and music will be available there. The Italian-Brazilian duo Ilario Adamo and Tiago da Silva Mendes are there ready to perform and to entertain us. I've been listening to them all weekend, and they're really worth listening to, especially over a drink or a bit to eat and with good friends and colleagues. I now give the word back to Anders Strømborg, who will be offering his closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Takk til deg, Laila, for å ha tatt oss gjennom en veldig spennende dag. Hun fortjener en liten applaus, synes jeg. Ambisjonen vår med denne dagen egentlig å gi litt perspektiver på det som skjer rundt oss i verden. Vi vet at veldig mange av dere som sitter her har mange vanskelige beslutninger som ligger foran oss og foran dere. Og ideen med det vi sparket i gang i fjor, det godt hjulpet til Anton som synes at det var på tide å få i gang det her fora. Så ambisjonen å bringe verden til Norge, og jeg håper vi har lykkes noenlunde med det. Og med det så ønsker jeg dere velkommen inn i den litt mer uformelle delen, og at dere tar dere tid til å prate litt med hverandre og stille litt oppklarende spørsmål. Og så håper vi ser mange av dere igjen på et senere tidspunkt. Takk for i dag.